They banished the sand mage to a desert made entirely of sand. They thought they had condemned him to death. They didn't know that inside that foreign body, a geological engineer had awakened, one who for 26 years had read the desert like an open book. And now he will scoop up a handful of sand and feel the grains obey him. First comes the cold. Foreign. Wrong. The sand under his cheek pricks and burns like ice. His body won't obey. Dan Carrow coughs and spits out dust. Someone kicks him in the back and hurls words at him in a language he doesn't know. But his body knows. His body translates it on its own. Get out. You're on your own now. He slides down off the cart, and the shackles click and fall from his wrists. The law requires that the iron be removed so the exile may die a free man. The cart creaks and drives away. The guard's lantern fades into the darkness. A minute later, he is alone. Completely alone. He raises his head to the sky and freezes. There are 2 moons in the sky. Not 1, 2. He sits down. He looks at his hands. Thin, long fingers. On his wrist, a brand in the shape of a crossed-out circle. His skin is dark. These aren't his hands. He's 26. He's a geological engineer. He worked in Arizona on dune stabilization. He was driving to a call in a storm. The car skidded. A canyon. A crash. Darkness. And now he's here, in a stranger's body, under a stranger's sky. Panic surges from his stomach to his throat. He clenches his teeth, closes his eyes, opens them. The moon is still there. All right, he's dead, or in a coma, or reincarnated. It doesn't matter. He scoops up a handful of sand and brings it to his face. Quartz, medium grain, moisture content around 3%. 6 hours until dawn. The engineer's brain kicks in before the fear lets up. This is good sand. This is familiar sand. And suddenly, the grains respond. They don't just fall, they obey. Faintly, barely perceptibly, but they obey. Fragments of someone else's memory bubble to the surface. Sand mage, lowest rank, useless power, banished, exiled to die. Dan smirks. They banished a man who knows how to work with sand to a place made entirely of sand? Thanks. He stands up. His legs are shaking. His mouth is dry. His stomach is empty. Endless sand dunes stretch all around. No fire, no road, no landmarks. He crouches down and presses his palm into the sand. A foreign magic reaches downward, with roots. Thin, weak, but they go deep. 3 meters, 5, 10. Dry, dry. At 15 meters, the density changes. Limestone. He can't reach any further. His strength is gone. He opens his eyes. Blood is flowing from his nose. The magic is working. Clumsily, but it's working. And now he has a lever. Small, frail, but a lever nonetheless. He heads south. He walks all night. His feet sink into the sand. His body craves water. His head is spinning. But if you stop in the desert at night without shelter, you won't wake up. He knows this not from magic. He knows this from a past life. At dawn, the wind shifts. Dan freezes. The air smells different. That's the smell of moisture somewhere nearby. Not water, moisture. He veers west. An hour later, he sees the first cactus. Gray, twisted, alive. He drops to his knees and digs through the sand with his hands down to the very roots. The roots go deep at an angle. They know where the water is. He follows the roots. Another cactus. And another. They grow in a line. An ancient dry riverbed. A wadi. He recognizes the pattern. He's seen it hundreds of times in Arizona. Somewhere downstream there's a depression, and in the depression, a lens. An underground pocket of fresh water trapped between layers of rock. He crawls along the riverbed until noon. The sun is scorching. Just the sun. At least that's normal. His lips are chapped. His tongue is swollen. He crawls, calculating the slope. He gauges the depth by the density of the sand beneath his palms. An engineer works even as his body dies. And then he sees tents, 5 of them, arranged around a stone circle, a well. An old man stands by the well. Children are nearby. A woman is hanging up rags. Dan crawls another 10 meters and falls face first into the sand. A child screams. They turn him over. The old man leans down and asks, "Who are you?" Dan licks his lips and answers with the language of his body. An outcast, a sand mage. The old man looks at the brand, then at the well, and says, "We're dying too." The well has been empty for a week. Dan peeks inside. It's dry. The stones at the bottom are white with salt. They give him a sip of camel milk. Warm, sour. The best thing he's ever tasted in both his lives. The men left to look for water 3 days ago and haven't returned. Only the women remain. The old man, the children. 10 people. They're about to break camp. A 3-day journey across the open desert. With children. Without water. Dan knows how this will end. He crawls over to the well and presses his palm into the ground beside it. Magic flows downward with great effort. He counts. 3 meters of sand. 5 of compact soil. 10. At 12, limestone. At 18, a chill sets in. Moisture. A lens. There's water. It's 18 meters underground. But the well wasn't dug in the right spot. He's standing 4 meters west of the water. 4 meters. Those who dug it missed by 4 meters and doomed themselves to death. Dan stands up. He's unsteady on his feet. He takes 4 steps east and jabs a scrap of chain into the sand. Dig here. At 18 meters you'll hit rock. Stop there. There's salt under the rock. The old man looks at him as if he were mad. A skinny boy, branded an outcast and with blood on his face, tells him where to dig the well. But the old man looks at the empty well, then at the children, then at the desert where they're headed in 3 days. And he starts digging. The women join in. Dan sits in the shade and keeps count. He watches the angle. He shouts when they veer off course. By nightfall, the pit is 6 meters deep. They take turns digging. The old man doesn't stop. At dawn, a chill drifts up from the pit. At 16 meters, the sand becomes damp. At 18 meters, the shovel hits rock. The old man shouts from below. Dan shouts back. "Stop! Don't dig any further! Wait!" An hour later, a thin trickle runs down the wall. By noon, there's water at the bottom. Clear, cold, fresh. The child lowers the bucket and pulls it up full. The woman cries. The old man climbs out, wet and covered in mud. Silently, he places a bowl of milk and his knife in front of Dan. An old knife. The handle is wrapped in leather. The blade is worn down to a thin strip. The best knife in the camp. Take it. You found water. Dan looks at the children splashing and laughing, then at the knife. And he takes it. This is his first oath. He doesn't yet know what it means. He doesn't know that in this world, giving a knife to a stranger means giving him your family. He doesn't know that the old man's name is al-Safa, and that his clan is one of the 12 great clans of the Great Dryness. He doesn't know that the dark-eyed girl who silently brought him water is the old man's daughter. He knows nothing. He simply found water because he knew where to look. And for the first time in 2 days, he falls asleep. On the sand, under a foreign sky with 2 moons, with a stranger's knife in his hand. He slept through the entire day and the entire night. When he opened his eyes, it was early morning. The light was soft and golden. A canopy of coarse fabric was stretched over him. A cup of water stood nearby. He sat up and drank it all in one gulp. His body ached. Every muscle ached as if he'd been beaten all night, but his head was clear. He looked around. The tent was small. The floor was covered with sand and a mat lay on top of it. In the corner was a sack containing something dry. His belongings were gone. Then again, he hadn't had any to begin with. Just the shackles they'd taken off. And a knife. The knife lay next to the mat. He picked it up and stepped outside. The camp was alive. That was the first thing he noticed. Yesterday, the camp was dying. Today, it was alive. A line of 3 women with jugs stood by the new well. Children were playing by the tent. Old man Harris was sitting on a rock mending a harness. When he saw Dan, he nodded. He didn't stand up. He didn't bow. He just nodded, as an equal. Dan walked over to the well and peered inside. The water level was good. The walls of the pit had already begun to crumble. That's bad. Without reinforcement, the well will last 2 weeks at most. The sand is loose. The walls are crumbly. It needs lining, stone, or something harder than stone. He looked at the sand beneath his feet. Quartz, pure, high silica content. Quartz has a melting point of about 1,700 degrees. That's high, but if you add a flux, soda ash or ash, the temperature drops drastically. He turned to Harris and asked if there was any ash at the camp. Harris nodded toward the fire pit. There was plenty of ash. They'd been burning dry brush and camel dung. The ash was alkaline, just what he needed. Dan gathered the ash into a clay pot. He scooped up some clean sand. He mixed it by eye. 3 parts sand, 1 part ash, roughly. Without a lab or scales, it was all by eye. Then he crouched down and concentrated. The magic of the sand worked with dry quartz. He could feel every grain of sand. He felt their structure, the lattice, the bonds between the atoms. He couldn't see it, of course, but he could feel it. Like a blind person feels the shape of a face with their fingertips. He clenched a handful of the mixture and channeled his magic into it. Don't move it. Don't lift it. Heat it up. Make the grains vibrate faster, faster, even faster. The mixture in his palm grew warm, then hot, then searing. He gritted his teeth and held on. The magic devoured his strength like fire devours paper. The mixture began to melt. The edges of the grains melted and fused together, a shapeless lump, murky, bubbly, horrible glass, but glass nonetheless. He opened his hand. A burn mark remained on his skin, but in his hand lay a fist-sized piece of dirty glass, hot, warped, with lots of bubbles inside, but hard, strong, and transparent when held up to the light. Harris walked over and looked at it. He took the piece in his hands, turned it over, looked through it at the sun, and for the first time in 2 days, something changed in his expression. It wasn't surprise. It was understanding. The old man had lived in the desert his whole life. He knew that sand was just sand, and now this outcast boy had taken sand and turned it into stone. A transparent stone. Harris asked if they could make more. Dan looked at his scorched palms. He said they needed a furnace, real heat. Magic alone wouldn't be enough. They needed fire, a clay crucible, and time. Harris nodded and called the women over. By evening, they had a pit in the sand lined with stones, a primitive furnace. Dan loaded the mixture and lit the fire. He added magic. He didn't do the melting himself. He helped the fire along. He nudged it. He directed the heat inward rather than outward. By nightfall, a pool of molten glass lay in the pit. Dan used magic to pull it into a long strip. The strip solidified, crooked and cloudy, but intact. He wrapped it around the top edge of the well. The glass fused with the stone. A ring. A sturdy glass ring around the mouth of the well. Not pretty, not smooth, but it held. He sat down next to the well. Blood was running from his nose. His hands were shaking. His vision was double. But he was smiling. It worked. Crooked and rough, but it worked. A girl with dark eyes approached and silently wiped the blood from his face with a damp cloth. He flinched at her touch. She said her name was Layla, Hadas's daughter. Dan said thank you. She looked at the glass ring around the well. She asked what it was. He wanted to say glass, but the word his body uttered was different. Frozen light. That was what the sand magic called glass in the language of this world. Frozen light. A beautiful name, Dan thought. more fitting than this crooked, murky ring deserved. He spent the next 3 days by the furnace, experimenting, changing the proportions. He added lime made from crushed seashells that Layla had found in a dried-up riverbed. The glass became clearer, more transparent. On the 4th day, he made his first lens. Rough, thick, with bubbles along the edges, but it gathered light. He held it up to a bundle of dry grass, and the grass began to smolder 10 seconds later. Layla watched, unable to look away. He said it wasn't magic. It was physics. She didn't understand the word. He explained that light travels in a straight line, but if you place a transparent stone of a certain shape in its path, the light bends and converges at a single point. And that point is hot. Layla listened with an expression he was beginning to recognize. That was how they listened to prophets here. He sighed. On the 6th day, men arrived at the camp. 3 of them, the ones who had gone to look for water. They found a dried-up oasis. They lost 1 man in a sandstorm. They returned empty-handed. And they discovered that the well was full. That next to the well stood a furnace from which strange smoke was rising. That their old man was sitting next to a stranger looking through a transparent stone. The eldest of those who returned was named Rashid, P. Harris's nephew, broad-shouldered, with a stern gaze. He walked up to Dan and looked down at him. He asked who he was. Dan answered, "An outcast, a sand mage." Rashid spat. He said that sand mages were useless, that he'd heard that his whole life, that every Verdian soldier had told them that before taking their water. Dan didn't argue. He picked up the lens from the ground and held it out to Rashid. "Look through it," he said. Rashid took it. He held it up to his eye and froze. The lens was warped and uneven, but it magnified. Just a little, but noticeably. Rashid looked at his palm and saw every crack, every line 10 times larger. He lowered the lens. He looked at Dan with new eyes. He asked what else he could do. Dan said he could find water, stabilize sand, make glass, build walls, and that he needed help. Because on his own, he could do very little. But with people who knew this desert, he could do a lot. Rashid was silent for a long time. Then he said, 2 days' journey south, there's a place the clans call the Dry Bowl, a large hollow between the rocks. There used to be an oasis there. Now there's nothing. If the sand mage can find water anywhere, let him find it there, and then Rashid will believe him. Dan nodded. Deal. He knew Rashid was testing him, and he knew he couldn't refuse. Because in this world, trust isn't earned with words. Trust is earned with water. They set out at dawn. Dan, Rashid, and a young man named Farouk, quiet and wiry. He carried a water skin and a bag of dried meat on his back. Layla wanted to go with them. Harris wouldn't let her. He said someone had to stay with the children. Layla looked at her father, then at Dan. She didn't say anything. She just handed Dan a rolled-up handkerchief. Inside was a handful of seashells, lime, for the glass. Dan took it and nodded. They walked in silence. Rashid led the way. He knew the desert. He didn't walk in a straight line, but followed invisible paths between the sand dunes. He avoided the soft patches where a foot would sink knee-deep. He stuck to the ridges where the sand was dense and packed down by the wind. Dan memorized everything. Every turn, every landmark. A dark rock, a twisted tree, the line of a dune crest. The engineer inside him was drawing a map. By noon, the heat had become unbearable. They stopped in the shade of a cliff. Rashid handed out a sip of water. Just one sip. Farouk unfolded the cloth and sliced the meat into thin strips. They ate in silence. Dan pressed his palm against the rock. Stone. Not sandstone. Granite. That meant bedrock was outcropping somewhere nearby. A good sign. Bedrock meant a stable foundation. On a stable foundation, water accumulates in predictable places. Rashid noticed that he was feeling the rock. He asked what he was doing. Dan explained as best he could. He said that the rock was telling him where the ground was hard and where it was soft. Rashid snorted. He said that rocks don't talk. Dan replied that they do if you know how to listen. Rashid didn't answer. He stood up and kept walking. At sunset on the first day, they saw the dry bowl. It was an impressive place, a huge circular depression half a kilometer wide, surrounded by low rock walls. The bottom was flat, covered with fine sand. Not a blade of grass, not a single stone. A perfect empty plate. Rashid said his grandfather remembered a time when there had been a lake here, blue and deep, fish, trees along the shores. That was 60 years ago. Then the water disappeared, overnight. It simply sank into the sand and never returned. Dan walked down to the bottom of the basin. He took off his shoes. He stood barefoot on the sand. He closed his eyes and he began to listen. The magic stretched downward, deeper than before. He'd been training every evening at Camp al-Safa, learning to pull the threads of magic farther, more precisely. 5 meters, 10, 15. Sand, sand, sand. 20 meters, a layer of compacted earth, clay, bad. The clay didn't respond to his magic, dead material. But beneath the clay, 25 meters, sand again, and stone, limestone. 30 meters. He gritted his teeth and pushed the magic even deeper. Blood trickled from his nose, from his ear too. 35 meters. There was space down there. Emptiness. A vast one. A cave, or a cavern. And inside it, moisture. A lot of it. Not a trickle, not a pocket of condensation. An underground lake. Huge. Cold. Dan opened his eyes and fell to his knees. Blood dripped onto the sand. Farouk ran up to him. Dan waved him off. He told Rashid there was water. Deep down, 35 meters, under a layer of clay. Rashid looked at him. He looked at the blood. He asked if it could be reached. Dan thought. 35 meters is deep. Digging by hand is impossible. But he isn't a drilling engineer. He's a geotechnical engineer. He doesn't dig. He works with soil. What if he didn't dig a well? What if he made a pipe? A glass pipe that would go through the sand and clay down to the aquifer. And the pressure in the underground lake would push the water upward. An artesian well. The simplest principle. Water under pressure seeks a way out. Give it an outlet, and it will rise on its own. He needed glass. Lots of glass. A long tube. He stood up and began walking along the bottom of the depression, looking for sand of the right quality. Quartz, pure, without impurities. He found it near the northern wall, white, almost sugar-like in appearance. Perfect. He worked all night. Farouk kept the fire going. Rashid watched in silence. Dan melted the sand in batches. He shaped the tubes, short ones, elbow length, thick-walled, rough, but hollow. He joined them together with magic. He melted the ends and welded them together. 1 tube, 2, 5, 10. By dawn, he had 20 tubes joined together into a single pipe about 8 meters long. It wasn't enough, but he couldn't do any more. His body was giving out. His hands were burned. His head was splitting. He lay down on the sand and said he needed a day's rest. Rashid nodded. Dan slept all day. Farouk repaired the equipment. Rashid walked along the edge of the depression and gazed at the horizon. By evening, Dan woke up and got back to work. 15 more tubes. That made 23 meters of tubing. Another night of work. Another day of rest. By the 4th day of his stay in the dry bowl, he had 35 meters of glass tubing. Ugly, crooked, with burrs and bubbles, but solid and sturdy. He walked to the center of the depression. He stood over the spot he had marked. He placed the tube vertically and began to press it into the sand. With magic, not with his hands. He loosened the soil in front of the lower end of the tube and compacted it around the walls. The tube sank centimeter by centimeter. The sand parted before it and closed behind it. 5 meters, 10. Dan was on his knees with his palms on the top of the pipe, guiding it blindly. 20 meters. Clay. The pipe slowed down. The clay wouldn't yield. He pressed the sand around the pipe, compacting it to the density of stone. The pipe moved like a needle through skin, slowly, painfully. 25. 30. Blood flowed from both nostrils. Tears streamed from his eyes, not from pain, but from the strain. 35. The pipe broke through the cavern. He could feel it. The resistance vanished. The lower end of the pipe entered the void, into the water. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then a sound was heard, a low hum, like a sigh. Pressure from below forced water into the pipe. The water began to rise. Slowly, then faster, and burst out of the top opening. A column of water shot 3 meters into the sky. Dan jumped back. Water gushed from the pipe and fell onto the hot sand. The sand sizzled and darkened. Rashid stood and watched. Farouk fell to his knees. Rashid stood. He didn't move. He watched the water gushing from the glass pipe in the middle of a dead basin where not a single drop had fallen in 60 years. Then he walked over to the fountain. He cupped his hands. He scooped up some water. He drank it. He looked at Dan and said one word. How? Dan was sitting on the wet sand, soaked from head to toe with blood on his face. He replied, capillary action and aquifer pressure. Rashid didn't understand a word, but he understood the main point. The boy branded an outcast had just brought water back to the dry bowl. That night they sat by the fire. Farouk couldn't sleep. He kept walking over to the fountain, touching the water and laughing. Rashid was silent for a long time. Then he spoke. He said that the Banu Najm clan lived in the south, the Star clan, nomads, 50 tents. They lost their oasis 2 years ago and have been wandering ever since. Someone dies every month. If the sand mage can do what he does, maybe he'll do it for them too. Dan stared into the fire. He thought. 10 people at the al-Safa camp, 50 tents of the Banu Najm. This isn't just a well anymore. It's infrastructure. Roads, water pipes, storage facilities, systems, engineering. He nodded. I'll do it. Dan had passed Rashid's test. In the dry bowl, at a depth of 35 meters, he discovered an underground lake. In 4 days, he fashioned a glass pipe and drilled an artesian well. Water returned to the basin for the first time in 60 years. Rashid believed him and told him about the Banu Najm clan, which needed help. They returned to al-Safa camp on the 6th day. Layla met them by the tents. She looked at the wet water skins and understood. She said nothing, but her eyes sparkled. Dan handed Haris a water skin filled with clean water from Sukaya Chasha. The old man tasted it. He closed his eyes. He said that this water tasted like the water from his childhood, cold and sweet. Dan didn't know what sweet water meant to people who had spent their whole lives drinking brackish sludge from the bottom of wells. For them, it was like a miracle. But for Dan, it was simply geology. A clean limestone filter, nothing supernatural. He sat down with Haris and Rashid and laid out his plan. He spoke at length. He chose his words from someone else's memory. Many words were missing. He had to draw in the sand. He drew the dry bowl. He drew the al-Safa camp. He drew a line between them. He said they needed a road, not a trail that would be covered in sand within a day. A road. A reinforced track made of compacted sand. He could do it. His magic could compress the sand until it was as hard as stone. Layer by layer. Not quickly, but solidly. A surface over which a load could be hauled. Over which one could walk at night without fear of sinking into the sand. Then he drew a dome over the well in the dry bowl. A glass dome, to prevent evaporation. Water in an open reservoir in the desert loses up to a centimeter a day. Under a glass dome, losses drop by a factor of 10. Plus, the condensation on the dome's inner surface drips back down. A closed cycle. Then he drew another point further south. Banu Najm. Another well, another dome, another road. A triangle. 3 points, 3 wells, 3 roads, the beginning of a network. Harris listened in silence. Rashid did too. When Dan fell silent, the old man asked how long it would take. Dan said 3 months. Rashid asked how many people. Dan said at least 5 for now. People to dig, to carry, to hold the tools. He himself would make the glass and reinforce the ground, but he needed helping hands. Rashid nodded. He said he would go to Banu Najim himself. He would tell them about the water in the dry bowl. If they believe him, they'll send people. A day later, Rashid left with Farouk. Dan stayed behind, and he worked. Every day from dawn until noon, he reinforced the road. He walked through the desert and pressed his palms against the sand. Magic entered the soil and restructured it. It didn't move it, it restructured it. The quartz grains pressed against one another. The gaps between them filled with finer particles. The surface hardened into a solid crust. The path was 2 meters wide. The reinforced layer was 10 centimeters thick. Each day he advanced 200 meters. Then he would lie down and couldn't get up until evening. Layla brought him water and food. He ate without tasting anything. He slept. He got up. He kept going. On the 3rd day, Layla went with him. She didn't ask, she just went. She carried a water skin, a knife, and a bundle of dry stalks. When he fell, she stuck a stalk into the ground where he'd stopped, so that in the morning he'd know where to continue. He asked why she was walking with him. She replied that someone had to make sure he didn't die. She said it calmly, as if it were a fact. He smirked. She didn't smile. She rarely smiled at all, but her eyes spoke louder than her face. On the 5th day of their journey, Layla told him about the desert, about how to read the stars, which winds blow in which season, where the ancient caravan trails run, which plants are edible and which are deadly. She knew this land as well as an engineer knows a blueprint. Every line, every curve, every weak spot. Dan listened and memorized it all. Her knowledge was no less valuable to him than his magic was to her. He told her that. She fell silent. Then she said that no one had ever told her before that her knowledge was valuable. The women in the clan weren't asked about the trails. They were asked about food and children. Dan said that was silly. If you know the desert better than anyone else, that means you're the most important person in the camp. She fell silent again. For a long time. On the 10th day, Rashid returned. 12 people from the Banu Najim clan came with him. Men and women. Thin, emaciated. One boy, about 10 years old, had lips cracked from dehydration and empty eyes. Dan gave them water from the well. Lots of water. "Drink," he said, "as much as you want." The boy drank for so long that Dan was afraid he would get sick. But the boy pulled away from the cup and looked at Dan, and smiled. A toothless, childlike smile. The oldest of the group was a warrior named Qasim. Dark-skinned, a thin scar across his cheek, eyes like a hawk's. He looked at the well, at the glass ring around the rim, at the road that already stretched 1.5 kilometers to the south, and he said he wanted to see the dry bowl. Dan led him there himself. 2 days' journey along the unfinished road and then across the sand. When Qasim saw the fountain gushing from the glass pipe, he stood there silently for a long time. Then he turned to Dan and asked if it was true that he'd been expelled from Verda for being useless. Dan nodded. Qasim said that the Verdans were stupider than he'd thought, and that was saying a lot, because he'd thought they were very stupid. Dan laughed for the first time in this world. For real. For the next 2 weeks, they worked together. Qasim brought more people. Now there were 25 of them. Dan divided up the work. One group was building the road. He was reinforcing the ground. They were clearing and leveling the path ahead of him. The second group was setting up camp in Dry Bowl. Tents, a pen for the camels, and a pit for the oven. The third group, led by Layla, was gathering materials. Seashells for lime, brush for fuel, reeds from the oasis for construction. Dan was working at his limit. Every evening he collapsed, exhausted. Every morning he got up and kept going. By the end of the 3rd week, the road was finished. A 2-day journey had been cut to one, a smooth, solid track from the al-Safa to Sukaya Chasha. The first caravan of 4 camels traveled along it without losing a single pack. Qasim said that in the entire history of the desert, no one had ever built roads. People simply walked and hoped. Now they had a path they could walk not by hoping, but by knowing. Dan stood on the road he had built with his own hands. Or, more precisely, with his magic and the hands of the 25 people who had believed in him. He looked at the smooth, light-colored strip stretching toward the horizon. It was his first real work in this world. Not a well, not glass. A road, a connection between people. Layla stood beside him. She said the road had no name. Dan asked if it needed one. She said that in the desert, everything that matters has a name. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "Let it be first line." She repeated it. First line. And she smiled ever so slightly. Dan built the first paved road between the al-Safa camp and Dry Bowl. The Banu Najm clan sent 12 men, including the warrior Qasim, who became an ally. Layla began working as a guide and advisor. By the end of the month, Dan had 25 people and 2 settlements connected by the road. The road was named the First Line. A month in the desert. Dan counted the days by the notches on a wooden pole near his tent. 31 notches. 31 days since he had tumbled out of the wagon onto the cold sand. During that time, he had found 2 water sources. He had built a road. He had made dozens of glass objects. He had learned to sleep on the sand, eat camel meat, and not grimace at the bitterness of desert tea. But today, what he had both been waiting for and dreading at the same time happened. His first contact with Verdania. Layla spotted him at dawn. A rider on the crest of a dune 3 kilometers to the north. Alone. Riding a horse, not a camel. A horse in the desert meant Verdania. Nomads ride camels. She woke Dan up. He stepped out of the tent and looked toward the dune. It was far away, but the figure was visible against the backdrop of the brightening sky. The rider wasn't hiding. He sat out in the open. He was watching. Qasim approached with a spear. He said it was a scout, a Verdanian border guard. They sometimes ride past the Bone Mountains to check if any of the exiles are planning to return. Usually they find nothing but bones. Dan asked what would happen if the scout saw the camp. Qasim said he'd return and report it. And then they'd send a detachment, 10 or 20 horsemen. They'd burn the camp, kill the men, drive the rest away. That's how it had always been. Dan thought, the scout had already seen the camp. He'd seen the road. He'd seen the glint of glass by the well. It was too late to hide. He had no intention of killing anyone. He told Qasim he'd go to him. Qasim looked at him as if he were mad. He said the scout would kill him before he even got within earshot. Dan replied that he wouldn't kill him. And he set off, alone, along the road, toward the northern dune. Qasim cursed and followed at a distance of 100 paces, with a spear. Layla stood by the tent and watched, motionless. Dan walked steadily, neither fast nor slow, his hands in plain sight, no weapon. He'd left Harisa's knife in the tent. When he was 100 meters from the rider, Dan stopped. The rider wasn't moving either. The horse was shifting from foot to foot. It was nervous. Animals don't like the desert. Dan sat down on the sand. He crossed his legs, and he waited. A minute passed. 2. 5. The rider urged the horse forward and rode down the dune. She rode closer. She stopped 20 paces away. It was a woman. Short red hair peeking out from under an open helmet. Freckles. Green eyes. A crossbow in her hands, aimed at Dan. She told him in Verdani that he had to state his name and rank. Dan's body knew this protocol. He gave the name of the body's former owner. He said he was an exile, a sand mage, lowest school. The woman didn't lower her crossbow. She asked what kind of structures he had in his camp. Dan told the truth. A well, a glass furnace, living tents. She asked how many there were. He said about 25. She asked why they were building a road. He said to travel between settlements. The woman was silent. She looked at him, then at the road behind him, then back at him. She asked where an outcast got glass. Dan said he made it. From sand. The woman narrowed her eyes. She said that sand mages don't know how to make glass. Dan shrugged and said this one does. She was silent for another minute. Then she lowered her crossbow. She didn't put it away. She just lowered it. She said her name was Hannah O'Brien, captain of the 3rd Border Outpost, and that she was required to report everything she had seen. Dan nodded. He said he knew, and he offered her some water before she headed back. Hannah gave him a long look. She said he was either very brave or very stupid. Dan said it was more likely the latter. She didn't smile, but something in her expression changed. The tension was gone. She dismounted. She led her horse closer. She took the water skin that Qasim brought over with a stony expression. She watered her horse. She took a sip herself. She stood there for a moment. She looked down the road, at the glistening surface of a distant well. Then she mounted and rode north without saying another word. Qasim asked why Dan had let her go. Dan said they had no reason to go to war. Qasim replied that there was already a reason. They were alive. For Verdania, that was enough. Dan didn't answer. He was thinking about the woman's green eyes who was looking at the glass well like someone who sees something impossible. Not with hatred, not with fear, with bewilderment. He returned to camp. He gathered everyone. 25 people, men and women, children, Old Man Harris, Rashid, Qasim, Layla. He told them that the Verdanians would be coming soon. Not just one scout, but a detachment. Maybe in a week, maybe in a month, but they'll come. And that they must be ready. Not for war, for defense. Qasim asked what the difference was. Dan said that war is when you go to someone to kill them. Defense is when you make it impossible for them to reach you. He explained what a dune fortress was. He drew it in the sand. A semicircle of fortified dunes surrounding the camp. 5 meters high, 3 meters thick, sand compacted to the hardness of stone. On the outside, a 45-degree slope. Smooth. A horse couldn't climb it. A man in armor couldn't climb it. At the top, a parapet with loopholes, but not for arrows, for a view. Inside the fortress, shelters, water supplies, and a glass warehouse. One entrance, narrow, winding, like the neck of a bottle. 10 men can hold it off against 100. Qasim listened. Rashid listened. Harris listened. When Dan fell silent, Qasim said it was a good plan. But building a wall like that would take months. Dan shook his head. He said he needed 2 weeks. Because he wasn't going to build a wall. He was going to grow it. That night, he left the camp alone. He stood facing north, toward Verdania. He pressed his palms into the sand and began to work. Slowly, layer by layer, grain by grain. He wasn't moving the sand, he was changing its nature. Loose sand became dense. Soft sand became hard. Loose sand became monolithic. The dune before him began to grow, not quickly, but unstoppably. By morning, a mound 1.5 meters high and 10 meters wide stood in front of the camp, solid as a rock. Dan lay nearby in a pool of his own sweat, blood on his face, unable to move. Layla found him at dawn. She dragged him into the tent. She wiped away the blood. She gave him water and broth. He slept all day. In the evening, he got up and went back to work. 2 meters high, he widened it by 20 meters. The next night, more and more. Qasim brought people to help. They couldn't do what Dan was doing, but they could carry sand, piling it into mounds that Dan would then compact. It sped up the work by half. Layla worked beside him every night, silently. She handed him water when he forgot to drink. She wiped away the blood when he wasn't looking. Once he fell and couldn't get up. She sat down beside him, took his hand, held it until he caught his breath. Her palm was dry and warm and rough from work. He thought it was the first human touch he'd felt since he'd arrived here. By the end of the second week, the wall was finished, a semicircle, 4.5 meters high, lower than he'd planned. He didn't have enough strength, but it was enough. 2.5 meters thick, a smooth, sloping outer wall. One entrance, winding, 3 turns. Dan stood on the crest of the wall and looked north. The wind blew in his face. The desert stretched to the horizon. Somewhere beyond the Bone Mountains, green Verdania was slowly drying up and searching for those to blame. And here in the south, in the place where 25 people had been exiled to die, they stood behind a wall that a boy branded an outcast had built out of sand. Layla stepped up beside him. She stood next to him. The wind ruffled her dark hair. She said the camp needed a name. Dan thought for a moment. He looked at the glass dome over the well he'd finished yesterday. The dome caught the light of the setting sun and glowed with a golden fire, like a little sun on Earth. "Mirrored oasis," he said. Layla repeated it. Mirrored oasis. And for the first time in all the time he'd known her, she smiled genuinely. For Dan's scout, Hannah O'Brien discovered the camp. Dan let her go with water, which sparked controversy among the nomads. Preparing for the inevitable visit from the Verdayan detachment, Dan spent 2 weeks building a dune fortress out of compacted sand around the camp. The first glass dome was installed over the well. The camp was named Mirror Oasis. Layla became Dan's closest assistant. Another month passed. Mirror Oasis had changed beyond recognition. 14 tents now stood behind the wall. There were 42 people. The Banu Najim clan arrived in full force. 50 people, women, children, the elderly, and warriors. They brought with them scrawny camels, nearly empty waterskins, and eyes full of distrust. Their chieftain, Salim, was a gaunt old man with a voice like the creaking of sand. He did not believe in the outcast's magic. He believed in the water that Rashid had brought in his waterskin. The water was real, cold, sweet. He had checked it himself. Salim led his clan to the dry bowl and saw a fountain gushing from a glass pipe. He stood there. He was silent. Then he said that his people would stay, not because they believed in Dan, because they believed in the water. Dan accepted that. He didn't need their faith. He needed their hands. Now he had enough people to work on 3 sites at once. The first site was the road from Dry Bowl south to the place where, according to Layla, the third oasis had once stood. The second site was the glass workshop. Dan could no longer make all the glass himself. His body couldn't take it. After every major melting, he'd lie motionless for a full day. He needed a furnace, a real one, a big one, with constant heat. He drew up a diagram, and Qasim and 4 men built it in a week. Stone walls plastered with clay. Air blown in from below through a pipe. A loading opening at the top. The temperature inside rose high enough to melt a mixture of sand and ash without magic. Almost without magic. Dan directed the heat in the right direction, but the fire did the bulk of the work. It was a breakthrough. Now he could teach others. He showed Farouk how to mix sand and ash. He showed him the proportions. He showed him how to load the kiln and when to remove the molten mixture. He showed him how to pour the molten mixture into wet sand molds. Farouk burned himself 7 times on the first day. On the second day, only 5 times. On the 5th day, he made his first glass. It was crooked and cloudy, but it was a glass. Dan patted him on the shoulder and said that the first glass is always crooked. Farouk carried that glass with him for 3 days and showed it to everyone he met. The third site was the most important one, the school. Not a building, just a spot by the fortress wall where Dan would sit every evening and teach. Children, adults, anyone who came. He taught them how to read the soil. He explained that sand comes in different types, coarse, fine, and medium. quartz, limestone, clay, that each type behaves differently, that water hides in certain places, and those places can be found if you know what to look for. The children listened with their mouths agape. The adults listened with their arms crossed over their chests. But they listened. Layla translated his words when his vocabulary fell short. She had learned to understand his thoughts before he could find the words. He would say that they needed to check the slope, and she would already be telling people that Dan wanted to know where the sand flows when the wind blows. Not an exact translation, but understandable. One evening, a boy from Banu Najm approached him, about 12 years old, the very same one with chapped lips whom he had given water to on the first day. The boy's name was Tariq. He sat down silently next to Dan and stayed there for the entire lesson. The next day he came again, and again. On the fourth day he asked a question. He asked why water doesn't rise in some places but does in others. Dan looked at him. It was a good question, the right question. He explained about pressure, about how water underground doesn't stay still but moves, slowly, very slowly, but it moves, and that it moves from places where the pressure is higher to places where the pressure is lower. Tariq listened without blinking. Then he asked if he could try to sense the water the way Dan did. Dan asked if he had magic. Tariq nodded. A dust mage, even lower than sand, the very bottom. His clan didn't even consider it magic, just a curse. Dan told him to place his palm on the sand and close his eyes. Tariq did so. He closed his eyes. His face tensed. Dan waited. A minute later, Tariq opened his eyes and said he didn't feel anything. Dan told him to try again. Tariq tried. Nothing. Again. On the seventh try, the boy's expression changed. His eyes widened. He whispered that he felt something below, far away, like a rumble. Dan smiled and said it was the water table. Tariq looked at his palms as if he were seeing them for the first time. That evening, Dan thought that school might be more important than walls. Walls protect the body, school protects the future. A week later, he had 8 students, 4 children, 4 adults, all with the magic of the lower schools. Dust, ashes, mist, sand. None of them knew how to do anything useful. At least that's what they'd been told their whole lives. Dan began to change that. A mist mage could sense the humidity in the air from a distance, useful for predicting storms. A dust mage could determine the age of organic material by its degree of decomposition, useful for finding ancient riverbeds. A sand mage could sense the tiniest particles in the air, useful for detecting approaching horsemen from kilometers away. Useless magic did not. What existed was a useless attitude toward them. Dan didn't say this out loud. He simply gave each of them a task that utilized their power. And when they succeeded, he said, "Good," and that was enough. Toward the end of the second month, 2 events occurred. The first was good. The third oasis had been found. Layla led Dan to a spot along the path south of Drybowl, a rocky ridge, a narrow gorge. At the bottom of the gorge, damp sand. Dan lowered his hand and found water within a minute. It wasn't deep, 12 meters, just a small stream between layers of limestone. Enough to support a settlement of 30 people. He drilled the well in 2 days. Water began to flow. The third point on the map, the third route. The triangle was complete. The second event was bad news. Rashid brought news from the north. A caravan of salt traders he'd met near the Bone Mountains reported that people in Verdania were talking about the desert. Rumors. The scout returned and told of a settlement beyond the mountains. About the road. About the glass. They didn't believe her. They demoted her. They called her crazy. But the rumors spread, and someone in the capital is listening. Dan sat by the fire and thought. Hannah O'Brien, green eyes, a crossbow. She came back and told the truth, and for telling the truth, they broke her. He felt something like guilt. She'd done her job. She'd reported what she'd seen, and she'd been punished for seeing the impossible. Qasim said they needed to prepare for the worst. The Verdans would send a detachment, not just a single scout, but a full-fledged punitive force. Dan nodded. He said the wall was ready. But a wall alone wasn't enough. He needed time to fortify the roads, Time to build backup wells. Time to teach the people how to hide and survive if the fortress falls. Qasim said they had no time. Dan replied that they would simply have to work faster. The Banu Najm clan had fully joined them. Dan built a glass furnace and began teaching people the craft. A school for mages of the lower ranks opened. A third oasis was found and the triangle of roads was completed. Rashid brought news that the scout Hannah had been stripped of her rank, and rumors of a settlement in the desert had reached the capital. 3 months in the desert. Dan stood on the crest of the dune wall of the Mirror Oasis and counted. 42 people, 3 oases, 3 roads, 1 glass furnace, 1 glass dome, 12 glass bottles, 8 students, 4 camels, 1 mule. That's not enough. Catastrophically insufficient. If Verdania sends even 20 horsemen, they'll crush everything he's built in an hour. The wall will delay them, but it won't stop them. They have water mages, the high school. They can draw moisture from his fortified soil, and the wall will crumble back into sand. He needs more people, more resources, more time. There was no time. So he did what he didn't want to do. He headed south, deeper into the great drought, to the place where, according to Layla and Qasim, the true clan warriors live. Those who haven't lost their strength. Those who roam with weapons and fear no one. The Banu Zahir clan, a warrior clan. 200 tents, 400 warriors, and a chieftain who wouldn't listen to a foreign boy. Dan took Qasim and Layla with him. Rashid stayed behind to command the Mirror Oasis. They traveled for 4 days. There were no roads, only sand, deep, soft, exhausting. Layla guided them by the stars and the wind. She knew these sands. She knew every turn, every landmark. A rock shaped like a sleeping dog, a dried-up tree with 3 branches, a red stone atop a dune. Dan memorized them all. On the 3rd day of their journey, they spotted a patrol. 2 riders on camels, wrapped in cloth from head to toe. Only their eyes were visible. And spears. Long, slender spears with bone tips. Qasim raised his hands and shouted words of greeting in the ancient desert dialect. The patrolman did not respond. One of them turned his camel around and rode off. The second remained. He sat motionless, watching. An hour later, the first one returned. With him were 10 more riders, and a woman in front, tall, with a scar across her right eyebrow, riding a jet-black camel. She stopped 10 paces away and looked down at them. Qasim called her by name, Nura, the chieftain's daughter, Nura al-Zahra. She didn't respond to his greeting. She asked why they had come. Qasim began to speak. She cut him off. She said she wasn't speaking to him, but to the one hiding behind his back. Dan stepped forward. He looked at her. She was a head taller than him. A scar across her eyebrow gave her face a stern look. Her eyes were dark and heavy, like stones at the bottom of a well. He said he had come to speak with the chieftain of the Banu Zahra clan. She replied that the chieftain was dead, killed 3 moons ago. Killed by the al-Qadir clan in a dispute over the salt trail. Now she leads the clan, and she doesn't speak to outcasts. She turned away. Dan called out to her back that he had water. She didn't stop. He said he had glass. She didn't stop. He said he had a road by which her wounded could reach a healer in a day instead of 4. She stopped. She didn't turn around, but she stopped. Qasim looked at Dan. Dan realized he'd hit the nail on the head. The clan was at war. And in war, the wounded don't die from their wounds, but because help arrives too late. Nura turned around. She said she'd give him 1 day. If, in 1 day, he didn't show her anything worth her time, she'd send them back out into the sands. Dan nodded. 1 day. They were led to the Banu Zar camp. It was enormous. 200 tents scattered across the bottom of a wide valley between rocky ridges. Warriors, women, children, camels, goats, dogs. The smell of smoke, leather, and manure. A lively camp. A powerful camp. And a dying camp. Dan saw it right away. The well in the center was almost dry. Women stood in line with jugs and received half a jug per family. The goats were skinny. The camels were calm only because camels know how to endure. But even their patience has its limits. Noura led him to the well. "Here," she said, "show me." Dan dropped to his knees and pressed his palm against the ground. He closed his eyes. He reached down, a familiar sensation. Sand, stone, clay. Deeper. 20 meters. 25. There's water. A thin layer. A lens. But it's shifting, slowly moving eastward. The well stands still, but the water is receding from beneath it, as if something were pulling it. Dan frowned. It was strange. Water underground doesn't move that fast. Not in 60 years. Not in 30. Something was pulling the water. Something big and distant and powerful. He remembered that feeling, but didn't dwell on it now. Right now, he needed to make an impression. He stood up. He walked 8 steps eastward from the well. He told Noura that they needed to dig here. She looked at him, then at the well, then at the spot he was pointing to. She asked what exactly he was going to use to dig. He replied that he didn't need a shovel. He sat down on the sand, placed both palms on the ground, and began to work. Not digging, parting. The sand parted beneath his hands. The grains loosened and spread out to the sides, forming a shaft. Slowly, centimeter by centimeter. A round hole, a meter wide, went down. Sand from the shaft rose up the walls and settled in a ring around it. 200 people stood and watched, in silence. Dan worked for an hour. 2. 3. The shaft went deeper and deeper. He reinforced the walls as he went, compacting them until they were as hard as stone. A tube of sandstone descending into the earth. At a depth of 20 meters, he reached the aquifer. The sand became damp, then wet. Then water glistened at the bottom of the shaft. He stopped, wiped the blood from his face, stood up. He was unsteady on his feet. Layla took him by the arm. He told Noura that the well was ready. Noura walked to the edge of the shaft and looked down. 20 meters of perfectly smooth walls made of compacted sand, and water at the bottom. She was silent for a long time. Then she looked at Dan. There was something new in her eyes. Not trust, not gratitude, calculation. She asked if he could teach others to do this. Dan shook his head. He said it couldn't be taught. It required the magic of sand and knowledge of what lay beneath the surface. But he could teach people to find water by other signs, by the terrain, by the plants, by the wind, and he could build wells and roads for those who joined his confederation. Noura looked up. She asked what kind of confederation it was. Dan explained. A union of clans. Shared roads, shared water, shared protection. Each clan retains its land and its chieftain, but together they are stronger than they are alone. Noura was silent. Then she said that Banu Zara doesn't kneel before anyone. Dan replied that he wasn't asking her to kneel. He was asking her to stand alongside him. Noura looked at the new well, at the water, at her people who were already lowering a bucket into it, at the children reaching for the water. She said she'd think about it. Dan nodded. Qasim then whispered to him that for Noura al-Zahra, saying she'd think about it was almost the same as saying yes. Dan went to the Banu Zar clan to secure the support of the desert's largest warrior clan. The clan's chieftain had been killed, and now his daughter Noura was in command. Over the spent several hours using magic to dig a new well in front of 200 people, Noura said she would think about joining the confederation. Dan noticed strange behavior in the underground waters, which were shifting eastward as if something were pulling them. The 4th month. Noura thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she sent a messenger. The messenger delivered a single word. Come. Dan went. This time, he wasn't alone. Accompanying him were Qasim, 20 warriors from Banu Najm, 10 workers with tools, and 4 camels laden with glass tubes and bottles. It was a statement. It is not a supplicant who comes to pay homage, it is an ally who comes bearing gifts. Nura met them at the border of the clan's territory, on horseback, with an escort of 50 female riders. Yes, female riders. Women. The Banu Zar were the only clan in the desert where women fought on equal footing with men. The tradition stemmed from the legend of the first female chieftain who, 300 years ago, repelled a raid by the Verdans all by herself with 30 young girls while the men were out hunting. Since then, every girl in the clan had known how to wield a spear before she could walk. Nura dismounted. She approached Dan. She looked at the caravan, at the glass, at the people, and she said she had a condition. Dan listened. The condition was simple and difficult at the same time. The al-Qadir clan, those who killed her father, they too roamed the great dryness. If Dan wanted a confederation, then the al-Qadir would have to join as well, but she would not sit around the same fire as her father's murderers. Hence the condition, the right to judge. When the al-Qadir joined the confederation, Nura would have the right to judge the murderer according to the ancient law of the desert. Dan thought about it. The right to judge under the ancient law meant death or exile. The choice was up to the judge. If he agreed, he would receive 400 warriors. If he refused, he would lose them forever. He agreed. Nura nodded. And just like that, without ceremony, without oaths, without bloody rituals, the Banu Zar joined the confederation. Nura set one more condition. She would command all military forces. Dan builds, she defends. He didn't argue. He wasn't a warrior, and he knew it. The next 2 months were the hardest and the most productive. Nura brought more than just warriors. She brought artisans, leather workers, weavers, a blacksmith who worked with bone and stone because there was no metal in the desert. Dan gave him glass. The blacksmith looked at the transparent stone and, a week later, began making arrowheads from it, razor sharp, transparent, almost invisible in flight. Nura saw the first glass arrowhead and, for the first time in Dan's presence, smiled. Briefly, like a flash. But he noticed. Dan worked non-stop. He built roads, the 4th oasis, the 5th, the same pattern every time. Find water, drill a well, erect a dome, lay a road, connect it to the network. Layla went everywhere with him. She became his map, his memory of the desert. Without her, he could find water, but couldn't find his way. Without him, she could find the way, but couldn't find water. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. He understood that, and it seemed she did too. One evening, after a long day's work, he sat by the fire and melted a piece of glass. A small piece, just for practice. Layla sat nearby, mending the strap of a water skin. They were silent. A good silence, not empty, but full. She suddenly said that when she was 16, her father had promised her in marriage to the chief of the Al-Mirad clan in exchange for 2 water skins. Dan stopped melting the glass. She spoke evenly, without emotion, as if stating a fact. The chieftain was an old man, 60 years old, 5 wives. She was 16. The wedding didn't take place because the chieftain was killed in a raid a week before the scheduled date. She was returned to her father, but the stigma remained. Sold, a commodity. 2 water skins, that was all she was worth. Dan was silent. He didn't know what to say. Words were useless here. He turned back to the furnace. He pulled out a piece of molten glass, hot, glowing. He placed it on the stone, and began to shape it, with magic. Slowly, carefully. The glass flowed obediently beneath his fingers. He was making a bowl, a small one, the size of his palm, transparent, with thin walls, smooth, bubble-free. The finest thing he'd made since arriving here. When the bowl had cooled, he picked it up and held it out to Layla. She took it. She looked through it at the fire. The fire inside the glass was golden and pure. Dan said that this bowl was worth more than 2 wineskins. more than 20, more than 200, and that he'd made it for her. Not for any reason, just because she deserved something beautiful. Layla held the bowl with both hands. She didn't look up, but he could see her fingers trembling. She didn't say a word. She stood up and went back to her tent. Dan thought he'd made a mistake, that he'd hurt her feelings. In the morning, she came out of her tent with the bowl tied to her belt. She wore it every day. She didn't hide it. She wasn't embarrassed. She just wore it, in full view of everyone. A week after that, Yenna came to the camp. No, she didn't come. She burst in. At night, through the wall, which in itself was impossible because the wall was 4 meters high and as smooth as glass. But she climbed over it. The sentry, Banu Zar, caught her halfway to Dan's tent, with a knife in her hand. A glass knife. That was the first thing Dan noticed when he was woken up. A knife, made of glass. Not his work, someone else's. Thinner, sharper, with a handle wrapped in black cloth. Professional work. Someone else in this world made glass. 2 warriors were holding Yenna. She wasn't resisting. Small, thin, dark hair, Asian features, eyes angry and wary like a cornered cat. She looked at Dan and said in Korean, "You're from there too." Dan froze. The words were from another world, his world. He replied in English, "Yes." She switched to English, broken with a strong Korean accent, but English nonetheless. She asked when he'd ended up here. He said 4 months ago. She laughed, shortly and bitterly. She said she'd been here for 5 years already, that she was tired, that she'd walked halfway across the desert because she'd heard rumors of a sand mage who could do the impossible, and that if he turned out to be just another local charlatan, she'd slit his throat with that knife. Dan looked at the knife. He looked at her, and said in English, "Capillary action, filtration coefficient, angle of internal friction." She froze. These were words no one in this world could possibly know. Technical terms, earth terms. Her angry eyes suddenly filled with tears. She told the warriors to let her go. Dan nodded to the warriors. They let her go. Yenna stood before him and wept silently. 5 years of loneliness in a foreign world ended in a single second. Dan didn't know what to do with the crying girl. He handed her a water skin. She took it. She drank. She wiped her face. And she said her name was Yenna Lim, a student in the chemistry department at the World, 22 years old, and that they needed to talk. The Banu Zar clan had joined the Confederation on the condition that Noura be granted the right to try her father's murderer and lead the military forces. Dan continued to build roads and oases. Layla told him her story, and he gave her a glass bowl. Yenna Lim, a Korean woman from another world who had spent 5 years in Arcane, had infiltrated the camp. She recognized Dan as a fellow Earthling by the technical terms he used. They talked until dawn. They sat by the extinguished campfire. Layla brought them food and left. Dan noticed how she looked at Yenna, a quick appraising glance. Yenna was telling her story. 5 years. She had arrived in this world at the age of 17. She woke up in the body of an orphaned girl at a monastery of the Order of the Origins in northern Verdania. The order worshipped the spirits of water. It preserved ancient knowledge. It oversaw the water mages throughout the kingdom. The head of the order was the Supreme Magister, Silas Morland. She uttered that name, and her face hardened. Morland had found her when she was 18. He discovered that she knew things an orphaned girl couldn't possibly know. Chemical formulas, the principles of distillation, the structure of substances. He didn't understand where she'd learned this, but he realized it was valuable. He wanted to use her as a tool, as a vessel for knowledge. To lock her away in the Order's laboratory and force her to work. For 2 years, she pretended to be submissive. She studied, she memorized. Languages, customs, maps, the structure of power, court intrigues, the Order's weaknesses. And then she escaped. She stole a glass knife from Morland's collection and slipped away through the monastery's sewers. She wandered for 3 years, through cities, through villages, along the borders. I made glass trinkets and sold them at markets. I learned to fight. I learned to hide. She learned not to trust anyone. And then she heard rumors. A sand mage in the Great Drought, making glass, building roads, finding water. The rumors were strange, too specific for magic, too much like engineering. And she went to check it out. Dan listened. Then he asked the question that had been tormenting him from the very first second. Why were they here? Why had they been transported here? Yenna shook her head. She said she didn't know. But she knew one thing. Something was calling her. Back there, on Earth. A voice. Not a voice, a sensation. A pull. As if someone were tugging on an invisible thread tied to her ribs. She thought it was depression. Then she thought it was madness. And then she fell asleep in the dorm and woke up in a stranger's body. Dan nodded. It had been the same for him. Not a voice, not a vision, a pull. Toward the desert, toward the sand. He'd chalked it up to occupational hazard, to a love of his work. It turned out to be a call. But whose? Yenna said she'd found a mention of it in the Order's library. Just once. In an old scroll that the monks kept but didn't read because it was written in a dead language. It took her 3 months to decipher it. The text spoke of the Sleeping Well, an ancient structure beneath the sands of the Great Dryness, built by a civilization that once lived here before Verdania, before all the kingdoms. The well was created to provide water to the desert forever. But something went wrong. The well spiraled out of control. It began drawing water not from below, but from everywhere. From the surface, from rivers, from lakes, from the clouds. Its builders realized they had made a mistake too late. They couldn't destroy it, they could only put it to sleep, freeze it, slow it down. They sacrificed themselves to seal it away, and it slept for hundreds of years. But now it's waking up. Dan remembered. The water beneath the territory of Banu Zahir. It was moving, shifting eastward. Something was pulling it. He told Yenna about it. She nodded. She said the drought in Verdania wasn't a coincidence. It's the well. It's drawing water from across the entire continent toward itself. Slowly, year after year. Rivers are running dry, lakes are drying up, and beneath the sands of the Great Drought, an underground sea is accumulating. And if the well were to fully awaken, it would spill everything out at once. It would flood half the continent. Dan was silent for a long time. Then he asked if it could be stopped. Yenna said that the scroll stated the well responds to sand magic, not water, sand. Water mages can only awaken it, sand mages can calm it down, or seal it away forever. That is why the Order of the Sources has been exterminating sand mages. Not because they are useless, but because they are dangerous. To the Order, for Moreland, for the entire system that rests on the belief that water is the supreme power. If a sand mage could control the well, the entire hierarchy of magic would collapse. 300 years of power, 300 years of contempt, all in a single second. Dan sat and watched the sunrise. Orange light flooded the desert. The glass dome over the well glowed like a small sun. He asked where the well was. Yenna said she didn't know exactly. The scroll pointed in a direction, east, deep into the Great Dryness, where even the nomads don't go. A place the locals call the Silent Sands, because there's no wind there, ever. Dan remembered that. The Silent Sands. Then he asked Yenna what she knew how to do. She smiled. She said she knew chemistry. She could make soap. She could purify water. She could make paints and ink. She could make gunpowder if necessary. Dan said they wouldn't need gunpowder. Not yet, anyway. But soap and clean water were what he needed most of all. Because the children in the camp were getting sick from dirty water and from hands they hadn't washed since birth. Yenna nodded. She said she'd start with the soap. There's fat, there's ash. Dan asked if she'd work with him. Not for him. With him. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said that for 5 years, not a single person in this world had spoken to her as an equal. Everyone had either been afraid of her or wanted to take advantage of her. He was the first to ask if she would work with him, not for him. She agreed. But she set a condition. a school. She wanted to teach, not just a craft, but chemistry, real chemistry, under the guise of alchemy if necessary, but to teach. Because if anything happened to her, that knowledge must not be lost. Dan held out his hand. She shook it. The handshake was firm, tight. The hand of a man who had survived alone for 5 years. From that day on, everything changed. Yenna worked like a woman possessed. In the first week, she made soap. Rough, smelly, but soap. She showed the women how to wash their hands before eating. She explained about diseases, not in the language of germs, but in a language the nomads understood. She told them that dirt carries evil spirits and that soap kills them. The women listened. They began to wash themselves. After 2 weeks, the children stopped getting sick to their stomachs. It was a small miracle, an unremarkable one, but for mothers who were used to burying every 3rd child, it was a revolution. Then she turned her attention to purifying water. The simplest filter, layers of sand and charcoal in a glass tube. Dan made the tubes. Yenna assembled the filters. The water came out cleaner and tasted better. Then she began teaching, in the evenings by the campfire, next to Dan. He taught geology, she taught chemistry. 8 students became 15. Tariq, a young dust mage, attended both classes. He listened intently. He wrote with a stick in the sand. He erased it. He wrote it again. Dan looked at him and thought that for this one boy alone, it had been worth coming here. Yenna told Dan her story and told him about the sleeping well. It is an ancient artifact that draws water from across the entire continent and threatens to flood it if fully awakened. The well responds only to sand magic, which explains why the Order of the Springs had been exterminating sand mages. Yenna joined the Confederation and began making soap and water filters, as well as teaching chemistry. 6 months in the desert. The Confederation had grown. 5 clans, 3 roads, 6 oases, 180 people. The glass workshop operated every day. Farouk learned to make bottles, smooth ones, almost bubble-free. 2 apprentices helped him. Yenna set up production of soap and filters. School was held every evening. Dan taught classes on soil and water. Yenna taught chemistry. Layla taught navigation and desert botany. 15 students. Tariq was the best of them. The boy was growing before their eyes, not physically, but mentally. He asked questions that Dan couldn't always answer right away. Once he asked why glass is transparent but stone isn't, if they're both made of sand. Dan spent half an hour explaining the difference between crystalline and amorphous structures using his fingers. Tariq listened. Then he said he understood, and he explained it to another student, in his own words, simpler and more accurate than Dan. At that moment, Dan realized he had a successor. But the settlement had its own problems. The first problem was food. There was now enough water. But people need more than just water. They need meat, grain, fruit. The desert provided none of these. Camels and goats provided milk and sometimes meat. Hunters caught lizards, snakes, and small rodents, but that wasn't enough for 180 people. Caravans carrying food arrived from the foothills once a month. Merchants charged 3 times the usual price for grain because they knew the nomads had nowhere else to go. Dan solved this problem in 2 ways. First, glass. He began making glassware to sell: glasses, bottles, plates, and lenses. Glass was a rarity in this world. Only the fire mages of Verdania made it, and it was worth its weight in gold. But Dan made it from sand. The cost was 0. The first caravan carrying glass set off for the Bone Mountains to trade. It returned with grain, dried fruit, and 3 rolls of fabric. Qasim, who led the caravan, said the merchants were speechless when they saw the glass bottles. Transparent, smooth, not a single crack. They offered twice as much as Qasim had asked for. He took exactly what he'd asked for. Dan said he'd done the right thing. Don't be greedy. Let them get used to it. Let them come back. The second method was more complicated: oasis farming. At the 3 domed wells, the humidity inside the domes was high enough for grow. Dan wasn't a botanist, but Layla was. Not a scientist, of course, a practitioner. She knew which plants could survive on a minimum of water. Thorns, wild barley, a bitter root that could be boiled into porridge. She planted the seeds inside the dome. 3 weeks later, green shoots pierced the sand. For the first time in decades, something green was growing in the great drought, not near a chance spring, but because it had been planted. The second problem was more serious: politics. 5 clans, 5 chieftains, 5 opinions. Salim of the Banu Najim wanted to trade openly with Verdania. Nura of the Banu Zar wanted to build a wall to the north and keep the Verdanians no closer than a day's journey. Haris of al-Safa simply wanted to live in peace and be left alone. The other 2 chieftains from smaller clans wanted whatever whoever shouted the loudest said. Dan convened the first council, under the open sky, by the campfire. All 5 chieftains, Qasim, Layla, Yena, Nura, he said they needed a common law, not a Verdan law that divides people into high and low. Their own law, a simple one. Water belongs to everyone. Roads belong to everyone. Each clan protects its own land. Disputes are settled by the council, not by the sword. Trade is shared. Defense is shared. Salim asked who would be in charge. Dan said no one. The council. 5 votes. Each chief has 1 vote. A decision is made if 3 out of 5 agree. Well, Ra asked what kind of vote Dan had. He said none. He's a builder, not a ruler. Nura looked at him for a long time. Then she said that a builder without a vote is a slave, and a slave doesn't build. A slave works. She said that Dan would get the 6th vote, an equal one, no more, no less. Salim started to object. Nura looked at him, and he fell silent. The council approved the 6 votes. Dan didn't want this, but he realized that Nura was right. Without a vote, they could push him aside at any moment, and he'd invested too much to let that happen. The third problem came from outside. A week after the council meeting, a detachment appeared on the northern road. Not Verdan. Worse, the al-Qadir clan, the very same ones, Nura's father's killers. 30 horsemen. Gaunt. Vicious. Without water. Their leader, Malik al-Qadir, rode ahead on a lame camel. They hadn't come to fight. They'd come to beg. Their oasis had dried up completely 2 months ago. They'd lost 18 people on the trek. Children, the elderly, the weak. Dan stood on the wall and watched them. Nura stood beside him. Her face was unrecognizable. Her hands gripped the spear so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Dan told her they had to let them in. She remained silent. He said there were children among them. She said her father's killer was among them. Dan said he remembered the condition. The right to judge remained hers. But first they had to be given water. Because there's no point in judging the dead. Nura stood motionless. A second, 2, 5. Then she lowered her spear and nodded. Al-Qadir was let in. They gave him something to drink. They were fed. Malik al-Qadir turned out not to be the monster his imagination had painted him to be. Short, tired, with a broken nose and sad eyes. He approached Dan and said he'd heard of him, that the sand mage was building a new world in the desert, that he had water and glass and roads, and that he let everyone in, even enemies. Dan said he had no enemies. There were people who needed water. Malik looked at Nura, who was standing 20 paces away, staring at him intently. He knew who she was. He knew what she was waiting for. He told Dan quietly that he was ready to face trial. Dan nodded. The trial took place 3 days later. Malik said he wasn't the one who struck the blow. His brother had struck it. His brother had died in that same skirmish. But Malik was the chieftain. He had given the order. Therefore, he was guilty. Nura stood before him, a spear in her hand. According to the old law, she had the right to kill him on the spot, or to banish him, or demand blood money. 200 people stood around in silence. Dan stood to the side. He didn't interfere. It was Nura's right and hers alone. She looked at Malik. He was on his knees. He wasn't begging. He wasn't crying. He was just standing there, waiting. Behind him stood his people. 30 people, children, women, warriors. Everyone was looking at Noura. She raised her spear, took aim, and thrust it into the sand next to Malik, a centimeter from his knee. The shaft trembled and then stood still. Noura said one word: exile. Not for the entire clan, for Malik personally. He is leaving, alone, without water. His people remain in the Confederation. They are innocent. Malik raised his head, looked at her, nodded, stood up, turned to his clan, told them to obey Noura, that she is a just judge, that he accepted the verdict. Then he headed south, alone, into the desert. Dan watched him go. Then he looked at Noura. She stood straight. Her eyes were dry. Her hands didn't tremble, but something in her had changed. Something had weakened, like a taut rope that had finally been let go. That night, Dan sat by the fire. Noura came and sat down beside him, in silence. They sat there for a long time. Then she said she'd wanted to kill him, that every day for the past 3 moons she'd imagined driving a spear into his throat. But when she saw him on his knees, when she saw his children behind him, she couldn't do it, because then she would become just like him, a murderer. And she doesn't want to be a murderer. She wants to be a chief. Dan didn't say anything. He just sat there beside her. Sometimes silence is the best thing you can offer. An hour later, she stood up and left. But before she did, she placed her hand on his shoulder, for a second. The heavy, warm hand of a warrior. And she left. A year in the desert. Dan stood on the roof of the first stone building in Mirror Oasis and counted the lights. 7 dots on the horizon, 7 oases, 7 glass domes that caught the light of the sunset and glowed gold. Between them stretched thin, pale threads of roads, his network. The Confederation consisted of 7 clans, 412 people. The school operated at 2 oases, 28 students. Glass workshops at 3 locations. Caravans carrying glass headed north twice a month and returned with grain, cloth, and iron. Iron was the most important of all. There was none of it in the desert, none at all. Every nail, every tip, every door hinge cost a fortune. Dan found a solution. Glass tools, knives, drills, arrowheads. Glass wasn't as strong as steel, but there was an endless supply of it. And he could shape it into any form. Yenna took it a step further. She learned to make lye from ash and fat, then acid from fermented fruit. Then she began experimenting with dyes. Blue from a mineral Layla found in the rocks near the 3rd oasis. Red from the bark of a thorny shrub. Green from ground wild barley leaves. She dyed fabrics and glass. Blue glass beads became the Confederation's first currency. Small, round, translucent with a blue sheen. Each one the size of a pea. Each one was worth exactly 1 sip of clean water. Not because someone set the price, because that's what the people themselves decided. A beautiful thing that fits in the palm of your hand and glows in the sun. People wanted them. Merchants traded for them. An economy was born from sand and light. Emma Carson arrived in mid-fall. She didn't arrive on her own. She was brought in. The Nuri patrol found her 2 days' journey north of the Mirror Oasis. Unconscious, sunburned, dehydrated nearly to the point of death. Her clothes were expensive but torn to shreds. Her hands were thin and white, covered in blisters, the hands of someone who had never done physical labor. Yenna nursed her back to health for 3 days. She gave her water drop by drop. She smeared fat on her burns. On the 4th day, Emma opened her eyes. Blue, cold, frightened. She began to speak in Verdian, quickly and incoherently. She asked where she was, who these people were, why it was so hot. Dan sat down beside her. He answered in Verdian, He told her she was safe, that this was the great drought, that the people living here who wouldn't harm her. Emma looked at the brand on his wrist, at the swarthy faces around her, at the tents, at the sand, and she began to cry. Not out of gratitude, out of horror. She was the daughter of Baron Carson, one of the few Verdian lords who had refused to sign King Alistair's decree expelling mages from the lower schools. For this, he was arrested, stripped of his lands, exiled along with his daughter to the Bone Mountains. The Baron died on the way. Heart. He was 58. Emma was left alone. The escort abandoned her at the foot of the mountains. She headed south because there was nowhere else to go. 2 weeks in the desert, alone, 19 years old, without water, without food, without survival skills. The fact that she made it out alive was a miracle, or sheer stubbornness. Dan suspected the latter. Emma was a tough one. The first week, she refused to eat from the communal pot. She grimaced at the camel milk. She looked down her nose at the nomads. Then she felt ashamed of her attitude. Then she looked down on them again. Then she felt ashamed again. Yenna told Dan that the girl was unbearable, but not mean, just broken. Everything she knew about the world turned out to be a lie. She'd been taught that the Verdans were a superior race and the nomads were filthy savages. And now the filthy savages had saved her life, while the superior race had killed her father. Dan gave her some time, 2 weeks. Then he approached her and asked what she could do. Emma lifted her chin. She said she was a wind mage, a weak wind mage, lower middle school level. In Verdania, this was looked down upon almost as much as sand magic. Dan nodded. He asked if she could sense the direction and strength of the wind. Emma said she could. That was the only thing she was good at, sensing the wind. A useless ability, according to her teachers at the academy. Dan smiled. He said it was the most useful skill he could imagine, because he needed someone who could calculate the windrows for the dune fortresses. Someone who could tell him where the wind was coming from and how strong it was at every point. Someone who could help position the sand dunes so they provided protection rather than burying everything. Wind and sand. Emma looked at him. Her eyes were changing. The cold was fading. Something else was taking its place. Not warmth. Interest. The keen, lively interest of a person hearing for the first time that their strength is needed. She said she'd try. She tried, and she succeeded. Emma felt the wind the way Dan felt the ground. From a distance, through her skin. She stood on the crest of a dune, closed her eyes, and spoke. North, northeast. 3 gusts per minute, intensifying toward noon. Change in direction in 6 hours. Dan listened and built. He positioned the sand dunes at an angle to the wind. He formed funnels that gathered the sand in the right place. He diverted the flows away from the settlements. Together, they worked as a single mechanism. She provided the data. He made the decisions. A month later, Emma stood knee-deep in the sand next to Dan at the construction site of the 8th dune wall, directing the workers with a voice that didn't waver. She had lost weight. She had tanned. Her hands had become rough. Blisters had turned into calluses. She no longer grimaced at camel milk. She drank it in one gulp and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Yenna said that the aristocrat had died. An engineer had been born. Dan said she shouldn't be like that. Yenna shrugged. At the end of the first year, Dan did what he'd been thinking about for 3 months. The first dune fortress on the border with Verdania. Not a wall around an oasis, a real fortress. He named it Al-Mikal, the Scales, because it stood on the border between 2 worlds, the green and the dry, and maintained the balance. 40 people spent 2 weeks building the fortress. Dan reinforced the ground. Noura oversaw the construction. Emma calculated the aerodynamics of the walls. Qasim supervised the workers. Layla handled the supplies. Yenna mixed the mortar to bond the glass blocks. Al-Mikal rose from the sand like a living creature. The walls were 8 meters high. The foundation was 6 meters thick. There were 3 tiers. The lower tier was solid stone made of compacted sand. The middle tier had loopholes and passageways. The upper tier had observation platforms. There were glass lenses in the walls. They gathered sunlight and focused it, not as a weapon, but as a lighting system. Inside the fortress, it was visible even at night because the lenses heated the stones during the day, which then slowly gave off heat and light. Nura examined the fortress and said she had never seen anything like it. She said that even the Verdun castles made of stone and wood were no match for this wall of sand. Dan said that it wasn't a wall, it was a message. Any Verdun scout who saw al-Mikyal would understand that behind it lay not savages but a civilization, and they would think twice before attacking. By the end of the first year, the Confederation numbered 7 clans and 400 people. Emma Carson, the daughter of a disgraced Verdun baron, joined and became a wind specialist. Blue glass beads became the Confederation's currency. The first border fortress, al-Mikyal, was built. Yena and Dan continued to develop production and the school. A year and a half. Rumors of the Confederation had spread across the entire continent. Merchants carried them north and west. Envoys from neighboring emirates came to see for themselves and left with sacks full of glass and wide-eyed wonder. They could not believe what they had seen. Roads in the desert, clean water in glass domes, children learning to read the ground, women commanding patrols, an economy built on sand and light. Grand Master Silas Morland learned the details before anyone else. He had his own spies, the quiet monks of the Order of the Springs who traveled with the caravans and listened. They brought him the exact figures: 7 clans, 400 people, 3 fortresses, 8 oases, glass workshops, a school, and a sand mage at the head of it all. Silas read the reports in his study in the Order's Tower, a tall white tower in the center of Verdania's capital. From the window, he could see the great river, the kingdom's main river. It had shrunk by 1/3 over the past year. The banks were cracking. Fishermen were complaining. Farmers were rioting. Water magic was waning. His own magic was waning. He felt it every morning when he tried to summon a stream of water to wash his face. Thinner, colder, more reluctant. The water was disappearing, and he knew where it was going. He knew about the sleeping well. He had known for a long time. The Order had kept this secret for 300 years. The well was their secret weapon and their secret fear. A weapon because through it they could control the water across the entire continent. A fear because if it awoke, there would be nothing left to control. Silas believed the well could be harnessed, to direct it, to force water to be drawn only from specific places, for example, from the desert, to drain the great drought once and for all, to destroy the nomads without a single soldier, and then open the well and return the water to Verdania. But to do that, a key is needed, and that key is sand magic. A sand mage who can touch the well and direct it. Silas had been destroying sand mages for decades. He had burned down the lower-tier schools. He had convinced the king that they were dangerous. He had convinced himself that it was the right thing to do. Because an uncontrolled sand mage at the well is a disaster. But a controlled one? That's a tool. And now a sand mage has appeared in the desert who cannot be controlled. One who is building a state. One who knows things he shouldn't know. Silas set aside his reports and summoned his aide. He said it was time to speak with the king. The punitive expedition left the capital a month later. 20 water mages, all from the Order. Not army mages, Order mages, the best. 50 guards. The expedition was commanded by Magister Doran, Silas's right-hand man. Young, talented, cruel by conviction, not by nature. He believed every word Silas said. He believed that lesser mages defiled the order of the universe. He believed that the desert must remain a desert. He believed that everything he did was for the greater good. Dan learned of the punitive expedition 3 weeks before their arrival. A dust mage named Sabir, one of his students, was the first to sense their approach. He was standing on the wall of al-Mikyal when he suddenly froze. He said the dust in the north was moving the wrong way, not because of the wind, but because of hooves. Many hooves. Dan lifted him up and placed him at the highest point of the wall. "Count them," he said. Sabir closed his eyes and listened to the desert. After a minute, he said, 70, maybe more. They're horses, not camels. Heavy, in armor, marching in column. Dan nodded. 70. This isn't a reconnaissance mission. This is war. He called a council. Noura unfolded the map that Layla had been drawing for the past 6 months. It showed all the roads, all the oases, all the fortresses, all the trails. Dan ran his finger along the map. The detachment is coming from the north, through the pass in the Bone Mountains. Further on, the only route south runs through a narrow valley between 2 rocky ridges, a stone labyrinth. The locals called it the Throat. Layla knew every stone in the throat, every turn, every dead end. Noura said they could set up an ambush and cut them off in the narrows. Dan shook his head. He said no. No deaths. Qasim asked how they could stop 70 warriors and 20 water mages without bloodshed. Dan said he'd show them. For 3 days, he worked in the throat. He didn't sleep. He ate on the go. Layla and Emma were with him. Layla pointed out where the walls were already narrow and where they were wider. Emma tracked the air currents. Dan rearranged the maze. He closed off some passages. He opened others. He set traps. Non-lethal ones. Sand traps. A wall that collapses and buries the path behind you. A sand dune that comes to life and blocks your way. A sandy pit into which a horse sinks knee-deep. It doesn't break its leg. It just gets stuck. A whirlpool that sucks in your boots. A sandstorm that blinds you for half an hour. And most importantly, the walls of the labyrinth are covered with a layer of glass. Smooth, slippery, impossible to climb, impossible to break through. Water magic is useless. Glass doesn't absorb water. The water runs down it and seeps into the sand. And the sand obeys Dan. Doran's squad entered the throat at dawn. By noon, they were lost. By evening, the horses were getting stuck in the sand every 20 steps. Water mages tried to break through the walls with streams of water. The water ran down the glass like a mirror. Until Doran ordered a retreat. The passage behind them was blocked. They found themselves trapped. A square 100 by 100 meters. Glass walls 6 meters high. The open sky above. Noura sentries stood along the edge of the wall, with crossbows. They didn't shoot. They just stood there. Dan climbed onto the wall. He looked down. 70 people trapped, angry, frightened, soaked from their own water. He told Doran and Verdani that he had 2 options. First, lay down their weapons and head north with the water and no casualties. Second, stay trapped and wait until the water runs out. How many water skins do they have? Enough for 3 days. In 3 days, the desert will decide everything on its own. Doran raised his head. He looked at Dan, his face contorted with hatred. He shouted that Dan was filth, dust, that the higher mages do not surrender to the lower ones, that the order would destroy him. Dan shrugged. He said he'd wait. Then he left. On the 3rd day, Doran surrendered his weapons. 70 men marched out of Gorla, without swords, without armor, each carrying a water skin enough for 2 days' journey. Dan stood at the exit and saw them off. Doran walked past without looking back. Bringing up the rear was a young water mage, a boy of about 18. He stopped. He looked at Dan. He quietly asked his name. Dan told him. The boy nodded. He said he would remember it. Then he left. Grandmaster Silas Moreland sent a punitive force of 20 water mages and 50 soldiers. Dan set a trap in the Throat Mountain Pass. The force found itself trapped in a glass labyrinth with no casualties on either side. 3 days later, they surrendered and were released with water. Master Doran swore to destroy Dan. Rumors of the victory spread across the entire continent. 2 years, 12 clans, 1,000 people. The Confederation had transformed from a handful of refugees into a state. A small one, poor by Verdun standards, but alive and growing. After the victory at Gorlo, the remaining clans came to Dan. Those who had been biding their time, those who hadn't believed, those who had been afraid. Now they believed. An outcast boy had defeated 20 water mages without spilling a single drop of blood. It was impossible, but it had happened. The first envoys arrived from the eastern emirate of al-Sharq, a small state on the edge of the desert, neither Verdun nor nomadic, somewhere in between. They brought gifts: iron, cloth, seeds, and a proposal, a trade agreement, glass in exchange for grain and iron, permanent, official, with seals. Dan sat in the council tent looking at the scrolls bearing the seals and thought that a year and a half ago he had tumbled out of a wagon in shackles, and now they were signing international treaties with him. The world is a strange place. Both worlds. Hannah O'Brien returned to the desert 3 days after the envoys, riding a stolen horse, without a uniform, without insignia, with a crossbow, a flask, and bags under her eyes. She rode straight to the gates of al-Nakal, dismounted, approached the wall, knocked with her fist, and she shouted that she was looking for the idiot who'd given her water a year ago. Dan came out onto the wall. He looked down at her. She looked terrible, thin, tired, but her eyes were the same, green, sharp. She said she'd quit the army, that her career was over, that in the capital they thought she was crazy, and that she'd come because the world outside the wall turned out to be more honest than the world where she'd served for 12 years. Dan let her in. Noura was against it. She said she was a spy. Dan said that was possible, but a spy who comes alone, unarmed, and tells the truth to your face is either a very bad spy or a very good person. Noura snorted but didn't argue. Hannah turned out to be invaluable. She knew the Verdun army from the inside. Tactics, strategy, weak spots. How many soldiers were in each garrison? Which mages held which positions? How the supply chain worked? How intelligence was organized? She laid it all out. Not because she was betraying them, because she'd stopped considering it a betrayal. Verdania had betrayed her first. She took a seat on the council as a military advisor. At first, Noura looked at her with undisguised distrust. Then Hannah showed her how to reorganize the patrol routes to cover twice as much territory with the same number of sadnits. Noura looked at the new diagram and said that Hannah could stay. A month after Hannah's arrival, Dan set out for the east, toward the Silent Sands, to search for the sleeping well. Accompanying him were Yena, Layla, and 4 of Noura's warriors. They traveled for 5 days. With each passing day, the desert changed. The sand dunes grew lower. The wind died down. On the 4th day, it vanished completely. Complete calm. Absolute silence. The sand here was different. Finer. Whiter. Almost like flour. And it didn't move. Not a single grain of sand. As if someone had stopped time. Dan felt it with his whole body. The magic inside him resonated. It pulled him downward. He wasn't pulling, he was being pulled. On the 6th day, they found glass. Not his glass, something ancient. The surface of the desert had turned into a solid sheet of glass. Smooth, perfectly flat, stretching to the horizon. Sand was visible beneath the glass. White, motionless, dead. Yena knelt down and touched the surface. She said it was fused quartz. Its melting point was over 2,000 degrees. Whoever had done this, their power surpassed anything they had ever seen. They walked across the glass for 2 hours. Then Layla stopped. She pointed ahead. In the center of the plain stood a structure. Not a building, not a tower, something in between. A glass hemisphere 30 meters in diameter, half buried in white sand. A thin crack ran from its apex, and steam rose from the crack. Warm. Moist. Steam in the middle of the desert. Dan walked over. He placed his palm on the glass, and it struck him. Not physically, magically, as if the entire desert were breathing through his hand. He saw it. For a moment. An image. A green world. Rivers. Forests. Cities of white stone. and a massive structure at the center. A cylinder plunging hundreds of meters into the earth. A water well, an eternal spring, the pride of civilization. And then disaster struck. The well spiraled out of control. It began to pull, to withhold. Pulling. Rivers reversed their course. Lakes vanished overnight. The greenery died in bands, spreading from the center to the edges. People fled. They screamed. Some stayed behind. They lay down in glass sarcophagi. They fell asleep, so that someday they might wake up and set things right. Dan yanked his hand away. He fell to his knees. Blood gushed from his nose and ears. Layla caught him. Yenna was screaming his name. He raised his hand. He said everything was all right. It wasn't okay, but he was alive. He told them what he'd seen. Yenna listened in silence. Then she said it matched what was in the scroll. The well isn't evil. It's broken, a mechanism without a break, and it's waking up. The crack in the dome is a sign. The steam is water bursting outward. If the dome cracks completely, all the water the well has accumulated over the centuries will gush to the surface. An underground sea, millions of metric tons. It will flood everything from the silent sands to the bone mountains, and beyond. Dan stared at the crack. Steam rose in a thin stream into the still air. He asked how much time they had. Yenna shook her head. A year, maybe 2, maybe 5, but no more. Dan stood up. He wiped away the blood. He looked at the dome. Then he told Yenna that they needed to find those who remained, those who had been laid to rest in the sarcophagi. If any of them were alive, he knew how to seal the well. They searched for 2 days. On the second day, Layla found the entrance, a hatch in the glass surface, covered with sand. Dan cleared it away with magic. A staircase leading down, long, dark. Yenna lit a torch. They went down. A hall, huge, glass walls, a glass floor, a glass ceiling, and sarcophagi, rows of sarcophagi, hundreds of them, all empty, shattered. The bodies had long since decayed. The bones had crumbled to dust. All dead, except for one. In the far corner of the hall stood a sarcophagus, intact and glowing, with a dim blue light. Dan approached. Inside lay a girl, a little girl, black hair, eyes closed, as if she were sleeping. Yenna looked at the inscription on the sarcophagus, an ancient language. She had spent 3 days deciphering the scroll. This was a different dialect, but the roots were the same. She made out the name, Sora, and a word that meant guardian. Hannah O'Brien returned to the desert and became a military advisor to the Confederation. The first trade agreement was signed with the Emirate of al-Sharq. Dan found the sleeping well on the glass plain of the Silent Sands. He witnessed the history of an ancient civilization and its downfall. In an underground chamber, the only surviving sarcophagus was found, containing a girl named Sora. Sora was awakened on the 3rd day. Dan didn't want to rush things. Yenna was examining the sarcophagus. The mechanism was magical, but the logic was engineering. The stasis field was powered by the well's residual energy. When Dan touched the glass, the field flickered. The sarcophagus recognized him. It recognized the magic of the sand. Dan placed both palms on the lid and slowly pulled. The glass parted like water. The air inside smelled of ozone and something floral. Sora opened her eyes. Dark, huge, frightened. She screamed. A thin, high-pitched scream. Not from pain, from terror. The last thing she remembered was the end of the world. Layla knelt down beside her and took her hand. She didn't say a word. She just held it. Sora fell silent. She looked at Layla, at Dan, at Ian, at the torches, at the empty sarcophagi all around. She understood. Dan saw the realization come into her eyes, slowly, like water seeping into dry earth. She was alone. Everyone was dead. Centuries had passed. The world outside the walls of this hall no longer existed. She began to speak in a language no one understood. Yenna listened. She caught individual words. An hour later, they were able to communicate in fragments. A day later, Sora began to learn their language, and they began to learn hers. A week later, she was speaking a mixture of ancient and modern, and Yenna translated for the others. Sora knew about the well. She was the daughter of its last keeper. She was 16 when the world collapsed. Her father placed her in the sarcophagus last. He said that someday someone would come who could seal the well, a sand mage. Because the well isn't water magic, it's the magic of structure, the magic of the earth. You can't seal water with water. You can only seal water with stone, with sand, with glass. Dan listened, and the world fell into place like a puzzle. That's why they called him. That's why they called Ian. The well was looking for those who understood not the water itself, but what held it in place. Sora explained how the mechanism worked. Deep beneath the dome, a crystalline structure rotates, a spiral of compacted quartz. It creates a field that pulls water molecules toward the center. To stop the spiral, you need to change its structure, not break it, but rebuild it, and turn the spiral into a closed loop. Then the field will close in on itself and stop pulling. The water will stay where it is. The underground lake won't disappear, but it will stop growing. Over time, the water will find natural outlets, streams, springs, and wells. The desert will slowly begin to come back to life, not in a year, but over decades, but it will begin. Dan asked what would happen to Verdania. Sora didn't understand the word. Yenna explained. The Green Kingdom in the north. Their rivers are drying up because the well is drawing water. Sora thought for a moment. She said that when the spiral closes, the pull will stop. The water will return to its natural channels. The rivers will fill up. Not right away. It would take years, but they would fill up. Dan nodded. He asked if he could do that. Sora looked at him for a long time. Then she said she didn't know. Her father had been the most powerful sand mage in the history of their civilization, and even he couldn't do it. He could only put the well to sleep, not seal it. Dan said that her father didn't know what he knows. Sora asked what it was. Dan said, crystallography. The structure of a quartz spiral can be rearranged if you know the exact location of every atom, if you understand how the bonds between the grains work. Her father was a great mage, but he wasn't a geologist. Sora looked at him. Then, for the first time ever, she smiled. A small, fragile smile, like a crack in glass. They returned to the Mirror Oasis 2 weeks later. Sora rode on a camel, clinging to the saddle with both hands. She had never seen a camel before. She had never seen a desert. Her world was green. When she saw the glass domes on the horizon, she stopped the camel. She stared at them for a long time. Then she told Yenna that it looked like her home. A little. Just a little. But it was similar. Dan settled her into a separate tent next to his own. Layla looked after her. The children at the camp accepted her instantly. She was strange and spoke funny and didn't know simple things. But she told stories about the green world that had once been where the desert now lay. The children listened with their mouths agape. To them, these were fairy tales. For Sora, they were memories. News from the north arrived sooner than Dan had hoped. King Alistair Vane had declared a crusade. Against the desert. Against the Confederation. Against the sand mage who had humiliated the Order of the Springs. An army of 40,000. The finest water mages, heavy cavalry, siege towers. They had set out from the capital in early spring and were marching toward the Bone Mountains. Hannah brought this news to the council. Her face was ashen. She said this was not a punitive expedition. It was an invasion army. 40,000 against 1,000. Noura stood up. Her hand rested on the hilt of her sword. She said she would fight, that every warrior of Banu Zar would die standing, that she would not flee. Kasim nodded. Rashid nodded. Salim turned pale but nodded as well. Dan raised his hand. He said that no one would die, neither on their side nor on the Verdant side. Noura looked at him as if he were mad. She asked how. Dan stood up and walked out of the tent. He looked south, toward the silent sands and the sleeping well lying beyond the horizon. Then he looked north, toward where the army had come from. Then he said, "I need 3 months." Hannah said he had 2. Dan nodded. "So, 2 then." Sora was woken up, and she explained how the sleeping well worked. To seal it, they needed to rearrange the quartz spiral into a closed loop. Dan believed that his knowledge as a geologist would give him a chance where the ancient mages had failed. King Alistair declared a crusade with an army of 40,000. The Confederation has 2 months to prepare. Dan hadn't slept for 2 months. Not really. He would slip into oblivion for an hour or two and wake up with blood on his pillow and a new idea in his head. He was working on 2 fronts. The first front was the glass field, a valley 3 days' journey north of the Mirror Oasis. It was the only passage through which an army could enter the great dryness beyond the Bone Mountains. Wide, gentle, sandy bottom. An ideal place for cavalry. And an ideal place for a trap. Dan redesigned the valley every night. Everyone was working. Nura commanded the men. Emma calculated the winds. Hannah drew diagrams of Verdun battle formations and showed where the cavalry would advance first and where the mages would deploy. Layla coordinated supplies. Yenna prepared glass dust, as fine as flour, harmless to the lungs but blinding in the light. Qasim and Rashid were building fortified positions on the flanks. Dan was doing the most important work. He was reshaping the valley floor. The top layer remained ordinary sand, soft and loose. Beneath it, at a depth of 20 centimeters, Dan had created a solid slab of fused quartz, glass. 1 kilometer long, half a kilometer wide. A mirror beneath a thin layer of sand. At his command, the top layer would crumble into the gaps between the slabs and expose the surface. The sun would reflect off the glass and blind everyone standing on the field. He had made the flanking sand dunes movable. They looked like ordinary dunes, but inside each one was a void and a mechanism made of compacted sand. At Dan's command, the dunes would begin to shift, slowly, but unstoppably, narrowing the valley, pushing the army toward the center, toward the glass. The second front is the well. Every 3rd night, Dan would go to the silent sands, alone. He would sit by the dome, press his palms against the glass, and immerse himself. He studied the spiral. He felt every turn, every grain, every connection. The structure was enormous, hundreds of meters deep, thousands of metric tons of quartz twisted into a spiral. His father would have appreciated the elegance of the design. The ancient engineers were geniuses. They simply failed to anticipate one thing: resonance. The spiral resonated with the underground waters and amplified itself, like a microphone held up to a speaker. Positive feedback. The more water it drew in, the stronger it became, and the more it drew in. A vicious cycle. To break it, you need to change the geometry. Turn the spiral into a ring, join the ends. Then the energy will circulate in a loop and stop drawing water from outside. Dan did the calculations, at night, on the sand. He drew diagrams, erased them, and redrew them. Yenna helped with the chemistry of the bonds. Sora explained what she remembered about the design. Tarek, the little dust mage who had grown 10 centimeters over the past 2 years, sat nearby and recorded everything on clay tablets. The solution came a week before the battle. Simple, elegant, ingenious. No need to rebuild the entire spiral. They just had to connect the top end to the bottom. 1 seam, 1 joint. Quartz to quartz. But to do that, they'd have to go down, inside the well, to the very bottom, where the water pressure would crush an ordinary person. Dan told this to Yenna. She said it was suicide. He replied that it might be, but the army would be here in a week, and if he didn't seal the well before the battle, Silas Morland might get to it first. And then Morland wouldn't seal it. Morland would open it. He'll unleash the underground sea and blame it all on the sand mage. The army arrived at dawn. Dan stood on a hill south of the glass field, his palms in the sand, his eyes closed. 40,000 men were entering the valley. cavalry in the lead, infantry behind them, water mages on the flanks. The banners of Verdania, green with a silver river, beautiful, bright, alien. All 6 of them stood beside Dan, Layla on the right. She silently held his shoulder. Yena on the left, with a water skin. Emma behind him, with her eyes closed. She was gauging the wind. Noura on the flank, on horseback, with 200 female riders. Hannah was on the other flank, with a crossbow and a glass spyglass that Dan had made for her. Sora sat at the foot of the hill and sang quietly in a dead language, a prayer, or a farewell, or both. Dan opened his eyes. The army had entered the field, in full force. He sent a messenger. Farouk rode out on a camel carrying a white flag. He stopped in front of the vanguard. He relayed Dan's words, "Leave and no one will die." King Alistair sat on a white horse in the center of the formation. Next to him, on a black stallion, was Silas Morland, dressed in the white robes of the order, with a staff of blue stone. The king looked at Morland. Morland shook his head. The king waved his hand. Attack! The cavalry charged forward. Dan pressed his palms deeper into the sand, and the glass field came to life. The top layer of sand sank downward. The glass was exposed. A kilometer of mirror-like surface flashed in the sun. The light struck the eyes of the advancing cavalry. The horses reared up. The riders screamed, blinded, disoriented. Their hooves skidded across the glass. Horses fell. The formation broke. Then the wind began to blow. Emma stood on the hill with her arms outstretched, directing the currents. Glass dust rose from the flanks and swept across the field. Fine, sparkling, harmless to breathe but unbearable to the eyes. The soldiers covered their faces. Water mages tried to wash away the dust. Water ran down the glass floor and seeped into the cracks, to no avail. Then the dune-like formations on the flanks began to move, slowly, with a grinding sound. The sand flowed like a thick river, narrowing the valley, pushing the army toward the center. Not crushing, not killing, squeezing. Panic. 40,000 people on a slippery glass field. Blinded, trapped, unable to advance, unable to retreat. The sand dunes behind them blocked the exit. The battle lasted 3 hours. 9 people died. 5 Verdans because their horses fell on top of them on the glass. 4 nomads from stray arrows. Not a single one killed by magic. Not a single one killed on Dan's orders. By noon, the army stood in the center of the field, out of formation, demoralized, with no way out. Dan came down from the hill. He walked across the glass. His footsteps rang out. He approached the king. Alistair Vane was sitting on the ground. His horse had bolted. His crown had slipped askew. Silas Morland stood nearby, upright, motionless. His white robes were dusty, but his eyes were clear and full of hatred. Dan stopped 5 paces away. He looked at Morland. Morland spoke first. He said that Dan didn't understand what he was doing, that the well must not be touched, that the world is held together by order, by hierarchy, by the fact that every force knows its place, water on top, sand below. It had always been that way. That's how it should be. Dan listened. Then he said that Morland knew about the well, that the order had always known, and that Morland had wanted to use it. Morland didn't deny it. He said he wanted to save Verdania, that a drought would destroy the kingdom in 10 years, that the only way out was to redirect the well, to take water from the desert and return it to the kingdom. Dan asked what would happen to the people of the desert. Morland was silent. He didn't consider them people, not because he was evil, because for 300 years he had been taught that they weren't people, that they were scum, dust, ashes, the dregs of creation. Dan said that Morland was wrong, that the well couldn't be redirected. It could only be closed or opened, and that if it were opened, it would destroy everyone, and the desert, and Verdania, the entire continent. Morland said that was a lie. Dan said it was geology. Morland didn't understand the word. Dan didn't bother to explain. He turned to the king, said he would let everyone go, with water, with weapons, but on one condition. For Dania must recognize the Confederation, not as an enemy, but as a neighbor. Trade, diplomacy, peace. The king looked at him, then at the field, at the glass beneath his feet, at the sand dunes that were closing in on his army, at the 1,000 nomads standing on the crests of the dunes, silently looking down. He nodded. Morland began to object. The king raised his hand, and Morland fell silent. For the first time in 20 years, the puppet had severed the string. The army marched away all day. 40,000 men across the glass field to the north. Dan stood on the hill and watched. He left 3,000 prisoners, the wounded and those who had fallen behind, until morning. He gave them water. He fed, he bandaged their wounds. In the morning, he let them go. Each left with a water skin. A small hand was engraved on every water skin, the symbol of the Confederation. Then Dan left, alone, eastward, toward the silent sands, to the well. Layla wanted to go with him. He said no. She looked at him. He saw in her eyes what he had feared, understanding. She knew he might not return. He said he would come back. She didn't believe him, but she let him go. She kissed his palm, the one he pressed against the sand. He walked for 3 days, alone, across the glass plain, toward the dome. The crack grew wider. The steam grew thicker. The earth trembled. The well was awakening. It sensed that the army's water was gone and pulled harder. Dan had perhaps a few days left. He descended inside, through the hatch, down the stairs, past the empty sarcophagi, deeper, hotter, more humid. At the bottom of the shaft, he found a spiral. He could feel it, a gigantic quartz structure stretching into the depths. It was spinning, slowly, but with monstrous force. The water around it hummed. The pressure was so great that the blood vessels in his eyes burst. The world turned red. He found the ends of the spiral, the top and the bottom. Between them was a 2-meter gap. 2 meters of that needed to be grown and joined, under pressure that would crush stone, at a temperature that would melt glass, with vibrations that would shatter bones. He sat down on the floor, placed his palms on the quartz, closed his eyes, and began to build. Grain by grain, bond by bond, atom by atom. Not magic at all, the magic of an engineer, who knows what he's doing, who understands every bond, every angle, every force. He built for 12 hours. Blood flowed from his nose, his ears, his eyes. His body was on fire. He couldn't feel his hands. He didn't stop, because if he stopped, he wouldn't be able to start again. 1 centimeter, another centimeter, one more. The quartz grew, slowly, stubbornly, just like him, like the desert, slowly but unstoppably. The last centimeter, the final connection. The top end of the spiral touched the bottom. The quartz fused together. The ring closed, and the world froze. The vibration ceased. The hum subsided. The pressure dropped. The water around the spiral slowed and came to a halt. Silence. Absolute. Deafening. Dan lay on the floor, unable to move. He couldn't feel his hands. He couldn't feel his legs. He could only feel his heart pounding. Slowly. Heavily. But it was pounding. He lay there and thought that Layla would be angry, that Yenna would say he was an idiot, that Nura would say nothing but bring him some broth, that Emma would burst into tears and deny it all, that Sora would smile her fragile smile, that Hannah would bring a flask and say something that was both rude and kind at the same time. He lay there and waited for his body to return. And the body returned, slowly, finger by finger. He stood up, fell down, stood up again, walked to the stairs, climbed up. Each step felt like a mountain. He went outside. The light hit his eyes. White. Pure. The sky. 2 pale moons in the daytime sky. He took 2 steps away from the day and fell, face first into the warm sand. He lay there, breathing. Then he laughed, quietly, hoarsely, in English. Okay, it worked. They found him 2 days later. Layla. Of course, Layla. She hadn't listened to him. She followed him. She walked for 2 days in his footsteps. She found him by the dome, unconscious, sunburned, alive. She poured water into his mouth, laid him in the shade, covered him with her raincoat, and sat down beside him, and waited. He came to at sunset, saw her face, dark eyes, dark hair, a glass bowl on her belt. She said he was an idiot. He said that Yenna should have said that. Layla replied that Yenna would say the same thing, but Layla said it first. He smiled. He reached out his hand. She took it, tightly. Dan descended into the sleeping well and, after 12 hours of working at the limit of his strength, closed the quartz spiral into a ring. The well stopped. The flow of water ceased. The rivers of Verdania will begin to recover. The desert will slowly come back to life. Layla found him unconscious and saved him. The catastrophe has been averted. A year had passed since the Battle of the Glass Field. 3 years had passed since Dan Carrow had tumbled out of the wagon onto the cold sand, still in chains. He was standing on the roof of a building that Kasim called a palace and Dan called a workshop. It was 2 stories high. The walls were made of compacted sand and faced with glass panels. The windows were real, transparent, smooth, without a single bubble. Farouk had learned to make perfect glass, better even than Dan himself. Down in the courtyard, Tariq was teaching a lesson. He was 14. He had grown up. He had matured. His voice was breaking, and he was embarrassed by it. But when he spoke about soils and water, his voice became firm. 8 students sat around him on the sand and listened. Tariq was explaining how to determine the depth of the aquifer based on the slope of the terrain. Dan listened and smiled. The boy taught better than he did, more simply, more clearly, in a language the students understood without translation. The Mirror Oasis had become a city, not a capital. Dan didn't want capitals, just a city. 1,200 people, stone houses, glass windows, water pipes made of glass, sewer system, bathhouses, a market, 2 taverns, a mosque, a school for 60 students, a glass workshop for 20 artisans, a smithy where glass and iron tools were made side by side, a hospital where Yenna taught 3 young women the basics of medicine. The Confederation united all 12 clans of the Great Sioux host, 4,000 people, 22 oases, a network of roads covering an area the size of a small kingdom. Caravans traveled daily. Glass went north, east, and west. Grain, iron, fabrics, and books returned. The books were Emma's idea. She said that civilization begins not with roads, but with letters. Dan didn't argue. The books were brought from the Emirate of al-Sharq. They were in the local language and in Verdian. Emma read them aloud to the children in the evenings. Her Verdian accent amused them. She didn't take offense. She had stopped taking offense altogether. She had stopped looking down on people. She had stopped feeling ashamed. She found her calling in her work. She did the wind calculations for every new settlement. Every dune wall, every barrier, every water catchment began with her wind map. Her weak wind magic proved indispensable. In Verdania, she would have been considered useless. Here, she was an architect of the air. The trade agreement with Verdania was signed 6 months after the battle. Not the king. King Alistair abdicated 3 months later. He broke down. He couldn't bear the shame. The new ruler was a regency council of 5 lords. Not a single member of the Order of the Origins was among them. The order lost its influence. It didn't collapse, but it lost it. When the army returned in disgrace and the water mages recounted what had happened on the glass field, faith in the invincibility of high magic began to crack. A small crack, but cracks have a way of growing. Silas Moreland disappeared, at night, from his tower. No one saw him leave. Hannah said he was alive, that people like him don't die, that he would return. Dan nodded. He knew. Moreland wasn't a villain. He was a man whose world had collapsed. And people like that either build a new world or try to bring back the old one. Moreland would choose the latter. But that would be later, not today. Hannah commanded the border defenses, 3 fortresses, 6 outposts, 200 warriors and 200 of Noura's horsewomen. At first, Hannah and Noura couldn't stand each other. A Verdun officer and a nomadic warrior. 2 strong women with different ideas about how to defend. Then they spent a week together at the northern outpost during a sandstorm. Neither of them ever spoke of what happened during that week. But after that, they worked like a well-oiled machine. Hannah planned, Noura executed. Or vice versa, it depended on the day. Noura had changed over the course of that year. The scar across her eyebrow remained. Her heavy gaze remained. But something new had emerged in her. Calmness. Not weakness, but a strength that didn't need to prove itself. After Malik's trial, she ceased to be the daughter of the slain chieftain. She became a chieftain in her own right. She would visit Dan in the evenings, not every evening, but once a week. They would sit on the wall, silent. Sometimes they talked. About borders, about people, about the future. Once she said that before she'd wanted only one thing, revenge. But now she wanted to never have to seek revenge again. Dan said that's called peace. She replied that it's harder than war. He agreed. Yenna opened a second school, in Dry Bowl, where the fountain still gushed from the glass pipe that Dan had made with his own hands 2.5 years ago. The pipe hadn't cracked. It hadn't broken. It stood there, just like everything he built, slowly and forever. Yenna taught chemistry, under the guise of alchemy, because no one understood the word chemistry, but the word alchemy commanded respect. She had learned to live in this world, not just to survive, to live. She had 6 students. 3 of them were already making soap on their own. 1 had learned to make ink. She wrote her first textbook, on clay tablets, in the local language, with illustrations. She gave it a simple title, How the World Works. Dan read it and said it was the best chemistry textbook he'd ever seen. Yenna said there wasn't much competition. And for the first time in all the time he'd known her, she laughed easily. Not maliciously, not bitterly, easily. Sora lived in a small house next to Dan's workshop. She hadn't grown over the past year. Her body remained that of a 16-year-old. Maybe it was stasis. Maybe it was just her nature. She didn't know. She taught Yenna her language. She told her about the ancient world. She drew maps of what the continent looked like before the catastrophe. Green, with rivers and forests and cities. The children begged her to draw more and more. She drew. Every drawing was a farewell, and every one was a promise. Someday the world would be like that again. Not in her lifetime, not in theirs, but it would be. She was no longer afraid that Dan would hate her for what her people had done. He had never blamed her, not once. Not with a single word, not with a single glance. She slept peacefully, for the first time in 200 years. The well was working, quietly, imperceptibly. The ring rotated within itself, a closed cycle. Energy circulated in a circle and flowed nowhere. The underground lake remained in place, but now the water had begun to seep upward, slowly, through cracks in the limestone, through layers of sand, through the roots of long-dead trees. In 4 places across the Confederation's territory, springs broke through the sand. Small, thin, but they were there. The water was returning, not in a torrential stream, drop by drop, just as it should be, just as it always happens in the desert, slowly. Reports from Verdania arrived with every caravan. The rivers had stopped drying up. The water level had stabilized. It hadn't risen, not yet, but it had stopped falling. The farmers noticed. The fishermen noticed. The water mages noticed. No one knew why. Dan didn't explain. It wasn't the right time. Maybe later, when Verdania would be ready to hear that she had been saved by a sand mage, the lowest of the low, the dregs of creation. Layla was waiting for him downstairs. He could see her from the roof. She was standing at the entrance to the workshop, talking to a merchant from al-Safa. A glass bowl stood next to her. That very one. The first one. The one he'd made for her by the campfire. Layla still carried it with her. Every day. The bowl had become a symbol. The women of the Confederation gave each other glass bowls as wedding gifts. It meant you were worth more than water. Layla didn't know she'd started the tradition. Or maybe she did and kept quiet. Dan went downstairs. He stepped out into the courtyard. The sun was low in the sky. Evening. A warm breeze from the south. The scent of warm sand, smoke, and fresh bread from the bakery. Layla turned around. She smiled, that very smile. A genuine one. A rare one. She walked over and handed him a cup of water. He drank. The water was cold, sweet, from a new spring. He asked how her day had gone. She said the merchant had brought some saplings, date palms, 3 of them. She wanted to plant them by the school. Dan looked at her. Date palms, in the great drought. A year ago, that would have been madness. Today, it was the plan. He nodded, said he'd plant them himself. Layla said she'd help. They walked to the school, along the road he'd built 2.5 years ago. The first line. It was still holding up, smooth, solid, not a single crack. Children were walking along it on their way home from school, running, laughing. One boy was holding a glass bead and showing it to the others. Blue, round, a little sun in the palm of his hand. Dan planted the first palm tree by the school wall. He dug a hole, placed the roots in it, covered them with soil, watered it with water from the spring. Layla planted the second one. Tarek asked to plant the third. Dan said, "Of course." Tarek planted it, carefully, gently, just as they'd been taught. 3 palm trees by the school wall. Small, slender, fragile, but alive. Dan stood there looking at them, then at Layla, then at the city, at the glass domes catching the last light of the sunset, at the roads stretching toward the horizon, at the children running home, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. 2 moons were rising in the east, a big one and a small one. The first thing he'd ever seen in this world. Layla stood beside him. She took his hand. He said quietly, in English, "Okay, now the real work begins." Layla didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She squeezed his hand tighter. They stood there, gazing at the horizon, at the desert slowly coming to life, drop by drop, grain by grain, just like everything else in this world. Slowly, but forever.